Chapter 1. The Whisper of Normalcy. In the early light of dawn, the village stirred like a gentle breath. The mist clung to the rolling green fields, weaving between the tall grass, its silver tendrils wrapping around the quiet cottages. Thatched roofs glistened with dew, each droplet catching the pale sunlight as if holding tiny stars. Smoke curled lazily from the stone chimneys, winding into the morning sky, a soft, fragrant whisper of warmth and home. Birds awoke in the trees, their soft melodies, a delicate song that seemed to float upon the crisp air. Sparrows fluttered between the branches, their feathers catching the sunlight in gentle bursts of brown and grey. A rooster's distant call echoed across the village, not an alarm, but a familiar comfort, a reminder that another day had begun. Along the winding dirt paths, the cottages stirred with quiet life. Wooden doors creaked open, and sleepy faces peeked out, feeling the fresh morning breeze. Farmers, wrapped in their woolen cloaks, stepped into the fields, their boots pressing into the moist earth. Each step left a mark, a quiet promise of labor and life. Their calloused hands carried simple tools, wooden rakes, rusted scythes, but in those hands they were the instruments of survival. By the village well, a young girl in a faded blue dress struggled with the heavy wooden bucket, her small hands gripping the rope as it slipped between her fingers. A kindly old woman appeared beside her, her silver hair twisted beneath a scarf, and together they drew the water, sharing a soft smile as the bucket rose, clear and shimmering. The golden light spread, brushing the rooftops, spilling across the village square where the market would soon awaken. But for now there was peace. The gentle, fragile peace of a world untouched, a quiet promise of another ordinary day. Echoes of laughter and life, the village square soon blossomed with. Life like a garden blooming beneath the sun. Merchants set up their stalls, their voices lifting in cheerful chatter. Woven baskets overflowed with fresh vegetables, their colors bright against the faded wooden stands. A butcher's shop displayed thick cuts of meat wrapped in brown paper, while the sweet aroma of freshly baked bread drifted from the bakery, warming the crisp air. Children, their faces lit with joy, chased one another along the dirt paths, their laughter a sweet, ringing melody. Their tiny feet kicked up dust and their hands reached out to catch the wind. A boy in a tattered tunic proudly held a wooden sword, swinging it with great dramatic flair, his friends watching in admiration. A girl with wild, curly hair skipped rope, her laughter blending with the rustle of the leaves overhead. Mothers bartered with merchants, their voices a soothing hum of conversation. A young woman in a simple shawl handed a few copper coins to an old man selling herbs, his wrinkled hands sorting sprigs of thyme and lavender with gentle care. Another woman adjusted her baby's blanket, pressing a soft kiss to the child's forehead as it stirred with a sleepy smile. The blacksmith's hammer rang out from the far end of the square, a steady, rhythmic sound, a heartbeat of the village. Sparks danced like tiny fireflies each time his hammer struck the glowing metal, shaping it beneath his practiced hands. The smith's face, darkened with soot, but softened with a quiet smile, reflected the warmth of the fire. Every corner of the village square was a portrait of life. The smell of fresh flowers mingled with the scent of warm bread, the laughter of children, the murmur of conversation, the warmth of simple joys. Beneath the blue sky, bathed in sunlight, life flowed like a soft, endless melody. The church bells, soft, collars, the morning brightened, The soft, slow chime of the church bell echoed across the village, a gentle, calming sound that seemed to float on the breeze. It was a call, but not a demand, a serene invitation, a reminder of faith and togetherness. The bell tower, tall and weathered, stood like a silent guardian, its grey stones bathed in sunlight, its shadow stretching across the cobbled path. The villagers paused, their faces lifting toward the sound. Some crossed themselves, murmuring quiet prayers, while others simply closed their eyes, letting the gentle melody wash over them. The old priest, his face lined with age but softened with a gentle smile, stood at the church's open doors, his hands clasped, welcoming each soul who wandered in. Inside, the cool air of the church wrapped around them, a quiet sanctuary from the bustling world outside. The wooden pews creaked softly as the villagers settled in, their voices fading into a soft hush. Stained glass windows caught the sunlight, casting gentle hues of blue, red, and gold across the stone floor, a mosaic of light that danced with each passing cloud. The priest's voice rose, not loud, but calm, a soothing murmur that spoke of faith, of kindness, of peace. His words were a soft river, flowing through the hearts of those who listened, a gentle reminder that they were never alone. And as the villagers bowed their heads, they felt the quiet comfort of togetherness, a fragile thread that bound them all. Outside, the bell's echoes slowly faded, drifting away on the wind, but its calm lingered, a whispered promise of hope and unity. The forest's silent watch beyond the village, the forest stood in quiet shadow, a vast, whispering presence that seemed to watch over them all. Tall, ancient trees rose towards the sky, their leaves a dark, endless sea that rustled softly in the breeze. Shafts of sunlight pierced the canopy, casting golden beams upon the forest floor, where ferns and wildflowers danced in the dappled light. The forest was a world of quiet secrets, a place where silence held stories, where shadows whispered of forgotten ages. Birds flitted between the branches, their songs mingling with the rustle of leaves. A deer stepped softly among the ferns, its dark eyes calm, its movements a gentle grace that seemed to flow with the wind. Children were told stories of the forest, tales of wandering spirits, of wise old owls, of hidden clearings where the sunlight turned silver. But to those who ventured close, it was a place of calm, a silent guardian that watched over the village. And yet beneath the quiet beauty, there was a hint of mystery, a whisper of something beyond sight. The villagers spoke of shadows that moved at twilight, of strange, distant cries that echoed in the night. Some said the forest was a friend, a protector. Others whispered that it held secrets best left untouched. But in the gentle breeze, the forest whispered its own song, a soft, rustling lullaby, a promise of quiet watchfulness, a reminder that even in silence there is life. The village breathed, the forest watched, and life flowed like a gentle river beneath the endless sky. But beneath the soft, familiar melody of daily life, there lingered a whisper, a faint, distant shadow, a soft unease carried on the wind. For even the brightest, morning cannot hold back the coming of the night. Chapter 2. The First Cold Whisper. The fields stretched beneath the pale morning sky, a sea of green and gold swaying gently in the breeze. The sun's light cast a soft silver glow across the dew-laden grass, each droplet catching the early light like tiny crystals. Birds fluttered above, their songs a delicate lace woven into the still air. But beneath this quiet beauty, a shadow stirred. Thomas, a sturdy farmer known for his laughter and strength, moved slowly between the rows, his heavy boots pressing into the damp earth. His hands, once strong and steady, now trembled slightly as he gripped the wooden handle of his hoe. Sweat beaded on his forehead, though the morning air was cool. His breaths came faster, each one a struggle, a quiet gasp swallowed by the wind. Shiver ran down his spine, sharp, cold, like the brush of an unseen hand. His vision blurred, the green fields swaying before him, the distant trees a wavering line. He paused, leaning against the hoe, his fingers gripping the rough wood so tightly that his knuckles whitened. But the cold did not leave him. It wrapped around him, seeping into his bones. His legs buckled. The earth seemed to rise to meet him, the golden grass rustling softly as he collapsed. The sky above stretched wide and distant, a pale, indifferent canvas. The sun's light felt thin, fading, its warmth a distant memory. A nearby farmer saw him fall, his cheerful whistle fading into silence. He rushed over, calling Thomas's name, his voice a faint echo in the vast open fields. But Thomas lay still, his face pale, his lips faintly blue. His breaths came in sharp, shallow gasps, like a bird caught in a storm. The village soon gathered, a quiet circle of worried faces. Strong hands lifted Thomas, carrying him back to his cottage, his body light, as if the strength had been drained from him. His wife wept quietly, her trembling fingers brushing his cold cheek, while the villagers whispered, soft, fearful murmurs that seemed to rise and fall like a distant, troubling wind. But they called it nothing more than exhaustion, a fainting, spell brought on by too much labor. They spoke of rest and warm broth, of the strength that would soon return. And yet beneath the hopeful words, a faint shadow grew, a whisper of something darker. Fevered dreams and night sweats. In a quiet, dimly lit cottage, the air was heavy, thick with the scent of damp cloth and bitter herbs. The fire crackled. In the small hearth, its glow a faint, flickering warmth against the shadows that seemed to cling to the corners of the room. On the small straw bed, little Emma lay still, her tiny body wrapped in a thick quilt. But the warmth that should have comforted her seemed to burn instead. Her forehead shone with sweat, droplets beading and trailing down her flushed cheeks. Her tiny fingers gripped the edge of the quilt, twisting it beneath her touch. Her mother sat beside her, a gentle hand resting on Emma's brow, feeling the unnatural heat that radiated beneath her palm. Her other hand clutched a damp cloth, gently wiping her daughter's face, her own eyes wide with quiet fear. Emma's breaths were shallow, her chest rising and falling too quickly. Her lips moved, whispering words that seemed caught between a dream and a nightmare. Her eyes fluttered beneath her pale eyelids, lost in visions only she could see, fields of silver mist, shadows that whispered her name, faces that faded like smoke. "Shh, my sweet," her mother whispered, her voice soft, desperate. "It will pass. It is just a fever. It will pass." But the words were a fragile lie, a whisper meant to comfort her own trembling heart. Emma's small body trembled, her head tossing weakly upon the pillow. The fire's light seemed to dance, flickering like a heartbeat, but its warmth never reached them. Outside, the wind sighed against the cottage walls, a faint, restless murmur. And in the village beyond, other candles burned through the night. Other mothers whispered soft prayers. Other children lay restless, lost in fevered dreams. Rumours at the market, the village square, once a place of laughter and life, now whispered, with a different kind of melody, the soft, uneasy murmur of fear. The merchants still set up their stalls, the vegetables still gleamed with morning dew, and the warm scent of fresh bread drifted through the air. But beneath the surface, something had changed. Did you hear? Thomas collapsed in the fields. "They say he cannot rise," whispered an old woman, her voice low, but sharp enough to pierce the morning air. "I heard little Emma has fallen ill too," replied another, her hands nervously smoothing the folds of her apron. "Her mother hasn't slept in days." "They say it's just a passing sickness," a merchant murmured, arranging his wares, but his eyes darted nervously around, searching the faces that wandered the square. "But more are falling ill," a young man whispered, his voice tight. "Old Peter hasn't been seen in days, and my cousin's boy's burning with fever." The words flowed like a slow, creeping fog, slipping between the laughter, clinging to the air. But for every whisper of fear there was a forced laugh, a bright smile, a desperate attempt to banish the shadow. The market still bustled, the coins still clinked, and the children still played, their laughter rising above the murmurs like birds scattering before a storm. But the shadow grew. It was in the way the mothers clutched their children's hands just a little tighter. It was in the quiet, worried glances exchanged between the villagers. It was in the hesitant steps of the merchants who now wiped their hands more often, who avoided touching coins for too long. The market was still a place of life, but beneath the cheerful calls of the merchants, beneath the laughter of the children, there was a whisper, a faint, cold whisper that seemed to linger in the crisp morning air. To the healer's quiet, worry in a small, cluttered cottage at the edge of the village, the healer stood, her grey hair falling in loose strands around her face, her wrinkled hands carefully sorting through a bundle of dried herbs. The scent of lavender and thyme mingled with the faint, sharp tang of camphor. But her hands trembled, just slightly, but enough that she noticed. Her gaze moved to the window where the village lay beneath the pale sunlight. She saw the smoke rising from chimneys, the farmers moving in the fields, the children's laughter drifting faintly on the breeze. But she also saw the shadows, the hunched figures walking slowly, the mothers carrying their fevered children, the worried faces that seemed to glance her way as though searching for hope. Her shelves were lined with small glass jars, powdered, willow bark for fevers, dried sage for sore throats, a thick, dark salve for aching muscles. They were her remedies, her quiet promises of healing, but now they seemed like fragile comfort. Leaves and powders in a world where the shadow of sickness was no longer a whisper, but a quiet, creeping tide. She crushed a handful of dried rosemary between her fingers, breathing in the sharp, soothing scent, but the calm it once brought her seemed to slip away, leaving only a quiet, gnawing worry. "There is always a cure," she whispered to herself, her voice barely louder than the rustling herbs. "There must be." But even as she spoke, her gaze drifted back to the window, to the village beyond, and in her heart the shadow seemed to grow just a little darker. The shadow had whispered, and now it was speaking, a cold, quiet voice that drifted through the fields, whispered in the market, and lingered in the healer's silent cottage. Chapter 3. The Plague's Silent Arrival. The village, once a place of cheerful laughter and bustling life, now lay beneath a shroud of silence. The market square, once alive with the scent of fresh bread and the cheerful calls of merchants, now stood deserted. Stalls that once overflowed with ripe apples and bright vegetables were empty, their cloth canopies swaying weakly in the cold wind. The shutters of the cottages were drawn tight, their windows dark and silent. The laughter of children, the soft murmur of mothers, and the steady rhythm of the blacksmith's hammer had all faded, swallowed by a quiet that seemed to press upon the air. Dust settled gently on the empty streets, untouched by the cheerful footsteps that had once danced along them. Only the wind moved, a soft, restless whisper that brushed against the closed doors and rattled the loose shutters. A stray cat, thin and wary, slipped between the shadows, its eyes wide and watchful, but even it seemed to sense the stillness, the feeling that something dark had crept into the village, unseen but felt. From behind the closed windows, pale faces peered out, worried eyes that scanned the empty paths, children pressed against their mothers, and fathers who stood silently, their hands resting on the window frames. They whispered to one another, their voices hushed, their words wrapped in fear. But few dared to step outside. The village, once a place of warm light and open doors, now seemed like a place of ghosts, a place where shadows lingered and the quiet had become a prison. And beneath that silence, beneath the empty streets and the closed doors, there was a sense of something more, a quiet, creeping shadow that seemed to watch from the mist. The toll of the bell, the silence of the village was broken only by the slow, solemn toll of the church bell. Its deep, mournful voice echoed across the empty streets, rising above the grey rooftops, drifting over the fields, and fading into the mist-shrouded forest beyond. Dong. A long, heavy note like a whispered farewell. Dong. Another, slow and steady, each chime lingering in the cold air. The bell's echoes seemed to press against the quiet cottages, slipping through the shuttered windows, curling beneath the closed doors. It was not the cheerful call that once invited the villagers to gather for morning prayers. It was not the joyful chime that rang on festival days. No, this was a different sound, a sound that weighed upon the heart, that seemed to darken the pale light of the overcast sky. Inside their homes, the villagers paused. Mothers held their children close, their fingers gently stroking tiny heads, whispering soft, trembling prayers. Fathers stood by the windows, their faces set, their eyes fixed on the distant church tower. Some whispered the names of friends they had not seen in days, names they feared were now carried away by the slow tolling of the bell. Dong. Each chime was a farewell, a quiet, wordless cry that floated on the wind, a whispered promise of loss. It marked the passing of those who had been swallowed by the silent shadow that now gripped the village. It marked the names that would no longer be spoken, the faces that would no longer be seen. In the churchyard, a group of sombre figures moved like shadows among the leaning gravestones. The priest, his grey robes billowing in the breeze, stood, with bowed head, his voice a quiet murmur of prayer. A small group of villagers, their faces pale and drawn, stood beside him, their eyes downcast, hands clasped tightly together. They had come to say goodbye, a farewell whispered to the earth, a silent prayer that seemed to rise with the grey mist. But even here they stood apart, their steps careful, their faces masked with cloth, as though afraid that even sorrow could bring them closer to the shadow. The bell continued to toll, each chime a slow heartbeat that seemed to pulse through the empty streets, a quiet, steady reminder of what had been lost. Dong, a life remembered. Dong, a name fading into silence. And still the bell rang, slow and solemn, its voice the only sound in a village that seemed to hold its breath. The healer's desperation. In a small, dimly lit cottage at the edge of the village, the healer stood, her grey hair loose around her weary face. Shelves lined with glass jars and bundles of dried herbs crowded the walls, their faint scents mingling in the cool, shadowed air. Lavender, sage, thyme. They were once her allies, her quiet promises of healing. But now they seemed like empty comforts, dry leaves and bitter powders in a world where the sickness had no name. Her hands trembled as she crushed a handful of dried rosemary, breathing in its sharp, calming scent. But the calm it once brought seemed distant, like a memory slipping away. Her gaze drifted to the small, cluttered table where an open book lay, old, its pages filled with remedies, prayers, and charms. But even these words seemed weak, their promises fading beneath the shadow of the sickness. One by one the villagers came, pale faces at her door, whispered pleas, trembling hands holding small, shivering children. She brewed potions, mixed poultices, whispered prayers over their fevered brows. But each day the shadows seemed to grow, and each day more faces disappeared from the crowded paths. Her own hands began to tremble, her voice faltering as she whispered the familiar words of comfort. But she knew, she saw it in their eyes, the fear, the quiet, desperate hope that turned to despair. She saw it in her own reflection, in the faint shadows beneath her eyes, in the lines that deepened with each whispered plea. "There is always a cure," she whispered to herself, her voice a faint, desperate promise. There must be. But her own words felt empty. Whispered prayers and pale faces. The church was filled with shadows, soft, flickering shapes cast by the dim candlelight. Villagers gathered beneath the vaulted ceiling, their heads bowed, their hands clasped tightly together. Their whispered prayers rose like mist, faint voices mingling, each one a quiet plea for mercy. Some wept softly, their faces buried in their hands. Others stared ahead, their eyes fixed on the faint glow of the altar, where the priest's voice rose in a low, calming murmur. His words were a soft, steady stream, a quiet reminder of hope, of faith, of a light that could not be seen. But beneath those whispers, beneath the trembling candlelight, there was a shadow, a quiet, fearful despair that clung to each word, each prayer. The village had fallen silent, but in that silence, something whispered. And those whispers were growing louder, louder. Chapter 4. Shadows at the Threshold. The village that once opened its arms to the sunlight now hid in the shadow of its own fear. The cottages, which had once stood proudly with open doors and wide windows, now seemed like silent fortresses. Their windows were shuttered tight, thick curtains drawn across the glass, leaving only faint, flickering hints of candlelight behind them. In the narrow streets, silence reigned, no cheerful greetings, no laughter spilling from doorways, only the faint, restless rustling of the wind against the wooden shutters, a soft, sighing whisper that seemed to beg for a voice. But the village had grown quiet, its voice locked behind closed doors. Mothers whispered to their children, pulling them away from the windows, their hands brushing damp curls away from pale foreheads. Fathers stood by the doors, their faces half lit. By the flickering glow of the fire, their eyes fixed on the silent paths beyond. Even the scent of freshly baked bread was gone, replaced by the faint, bitter smell of herbs. Bundles of dried lavender and rosemary hung beside the doorways, a quiet prayer for protection. From the darkened windows, shadows watched. A small, face pressed against the glass, eyes wide, peering out at the empty street, but was quickly pulled back by a trembling hand. Another shadow moved beyond the curtains, a figure pacing in quiet, nervous circles. The village had become a place of ghosts. Shadows moving behind glass, voices caught in whispers, lives hidden away in the thin, fragile shells of their homes. The paths that had once been so familiar now seemed like silent, haunted corridors. A place where even the sunlight felt cold, its light slipping through the narrow gaps between the closed shutters. And beyond those windows, the wind whispered, a faint, restless voice that seemed to brush against the walls, pressing against the doors, begging to be heard. But the village did not answer. It only watched, hidden behind the shadowed glass. Fear in the eyes of the young, the children, who had once run freely through the fields and chased each other along the dusty paths, now hid behind the safety of their cottage walls. Their laughter, once bright and wild, had faded to whispers, quiet, nervous murmurs shared in dark corners, far from the watching eyes of their parents. Little Emma, with her wide, frightened eyes, pressed herself against her mother's side, her tiny fingers clutching the edge of her mother's shawl. She did not understand why she could no longer play in the garden, why the door was always closed, why her friends did not visit anymore. Her mother spoke softly, brushing a gentle hand through Emma's dark curls, but her voice trembled, a quiet, comforting lie wrapped in fear. Other children sat by the narrow windows, their small faces pale, their eyes wide with quiet dread. They watched the empty paths, searching for familiar faces, for friends who no longer came, for a world that seemed to have vanished beyond the closed doors. They whispered to one another, their tiny voices trembling with half-understood fears. They spoke of shadows, of quiet sickness, of names they had not heard in days. They told stories, tales of ghosts wandering the mist, of witches who whispered from the shadows, of monsters that waited in the dark. But these were not the cheerful stories they once shared around the fire. These were stories whispered in fear, stories that seemed to cling to the cold air. The older children watched their parents, saw the quiet worry in their eyes, saw the way they whispered when they thought no one was listening. They saw the candles burning late into the night, the hurried prayers whispered in the darkness. And beneath that silence, beneath the quiet, fearful whispers, the children's eyes grew darker, their laughter fading to shadows. A village divided. Village, once a place of friendship and familiar faces, had become a place of suspicion. Neighbors who once shared bread and stories across the garden fence now avoided each other's gaze. The paths that had once echoed with cheerful greetings now seemed like narrow, shadowed corridors where even the breeze felt cold. Old friends no longer visited, their familiar faces now hidden behind cloth masks, their voices muffled and wary. A knock at the door, once a sound of joy, was now met with silence, or a cautious voice asking from behind the locked door, "Who is it?" Families grew distant. Brothers avoided their sisters. Parents stood apart from their own children, their hands trembling with fear each time they touched. Even the warmth of an embrace seemed dangerous now, a quiet, whispered threat that might carry the shadow of sickness. The village square, once a place of life, had become a place of whispers. Those who dared to step outside did so with quick, wary steps, their faces hidden, their hands wrapped in cloth. They exchanged glances, sharp, nervous looks that seemed to question, to doubt. Was it you? Did you bring this darkness? Did you carry it in your breath, in your touch, Even the church, once a place of comfort, seemed a shadowed refuge. The priest's voice, once a calm, steady river of faith, now trembled as he spoke. The pews were half empty, and those who did come sat far apart, their prayers whispered through, cloth their eyes downcast. A village once bound by friendship was now a village of strangers, each heart locked away behind walls of quiet fear. Whispers of blame and suspicion. The darkness that clung to the village was no longer just a silent shadow. It had found a voice, a whisper that drifted through the narrow streets, that slipped beneath the closed doors, that stirred the cold air. And that voice spoke in fear. It is her. The healer's herbs brought this curse upon us. No, it is the widow in the forest. She knows dark charms. I've seen her whisper to the trees. Did you see old Peter's wife? She prayed, too long at the grave. It is her grief. It has turned into a curse. The whispers grew louder. Friends who had once shared smiles now exchanged quiet, suspicious glances. A mother stepped away from her neighbor, pulling her child close. A young man turned his face when an old woman passed by, his hand tightening on the small cross around his neck. The healer, who had once been a symbol of comfort, now saw wary eyes watching her. The children who had once run to her with scraped knees now hid behind their mothers. And she, who had tried so hard to heal, now found her door marked with a faint, chalked symbol, a quiet, fearful warning. The village, once a place of warmth, was now a place of blame. Shadows moved in the night, figures who whispered in the mist, who left stones at doorsteps, who muttered prayers against curses, and the wind carried those whispers, sweeping through the village, a faint, desperate murmur. In the cold silence, beneath the grey, shadowed sky, the village seemed to fracture. A place of fear, of whispers, of quiet, growing rage. The village had changed. The sunlight had faded, the laughter had vanished, and the warmth of friendship had turned to cold suspicion. And beneath that quiet, beneath the shuttered windows and the whispered prayers, something dark had taken root. A shadow that whispered not just of sickness, but of fear. Chapter 5. The Healer's Last Hope. The healer's garden, once a place of vibrant life, now lay under a quiet shadow. The herbs that had once stood tall and green beneath the sun now hung limp, their leaves withering, their colours fading to pale yellows and brittle browns. Lavender, which once spread its sweet, calming scent, now drooped, its purple blooms withered to dry, crumbling petals. Thyme, once thick and lush, now lay scattered in patches, its stems dry and brittle. The healer stood among the dying plants, her hands trembling as she gently touched a wilted leaf. Her fingers, once steady and strong, now shook slightly, her touch soft but desperate, as if she could bring life back into the fading green. But her touch brought no warmth, her whispered words carried no power. She knelt by the rosemary bush, once strong and fragrant, now a twisted cluster of dry, silver leaves. The soil beneath her fingertips felt cold, its richness drained away. A faint, bitter scent rose from the crushed leaves beneath her touch, the smell of decay, of something that had quietly slipped beyond her reach. Her garden, once her refuge, a place of calm, of healing, of whispered hope, now seemed like a graveyard. Each leaf that fell, each flower that crumbled beneath her touch, seemed like a quiet, dying breath, a whispered reminder of her fading strength, But it was not just the garden that was dying, it was hope. Hope that her hands, her herbs, her whispered prayers could bring healing. Hope that her touch could banish the shadow that had fallen over the village. The wind stirred the dry leaves, a faint, restless sigh that seemed to whisper against her cheek, and as she stood among the withered herbs, her shadow stretched long and thin across the fading green. Desperate measures and ancient recipes, inside her small, shadowed cottage, the healer's hands trembled as she opened a thick, leather-bound book. Its pages were old, yellowed with age, the ink faded but still legible. It was her grandmother's book, a tome of ancient remedies, whispered charms, and forgotten recipes. Pages filled with the wisdom of those who had healed before her, those who had believed that nature held the power to cure. Her eyes moved quickly, scanning the cramped, elegant script. Willow bark for fever, thyme for strength, elderberry for the breath. The words were like old friends, but now they seemed thin, empty, their promises fading like mist in the morning light. Her shelves were lined with glass jars, their contents dry and brittle. Lavender, sage, and yarrow, herbs that had once brought comfort, now seemed like shadows of their former selves. She crushed a handful of dried rosemary between her fingers, breathing in its sharp, soothing scent. But even the scent seemed weak, fading too quickly. Desperation tightened her chest. Her fingers traced the curling pages, turning faster, her eyes growing wild. Old remedies, forgotten charms, even prayers scribbled in the margins. She whispered them beneath her breath, her voice a soft, trembling murmur that seemed to cling to the cool air. There must be something. There must be something. But the words were old, the pages were dry, and her hope seemed to crumble like the leaves beneath her touch, and yet she did not stop. Even as the candlelight flickered, even as the shadows deepened, she read on, her eyes moving faster, her whispers growing desperate, for she could not abandon them. She could not leave her village to the shadow way. The silent prayer of the healer in the pale grey light of dawn. The healer stepped out of her cottage, her shawl wrapped tightly around her thin shoulders. Her breath clouded the cold air as she made her way down the narrow path, her steps slow, her eyes fixed on the distant shape of the church, its bell tower rising against the mist. The wind whispered through the trees, brushing against her cheek, but she did not turn back. Her feet moved, steady but weary, her fingers gripping the edge of her shawl. Her eyes were dark, her face lined with quiet sorrow. But there was something else there, something faint but unbroken. At the church, she knelt before the weathered steps, her knees pressing into the cold, damp earth. Her trembling hands folded before her, her head bowed, her grey hair falling across her face. And in the stillness she whispered, a quiet, desperate prayer. Please, grant me strength, grant me wisdom. Do not let them fall, do not let them die. Not because of my weakness. Her voice was a soft, trembling whisper, her breath slipping away in pale mist. The wind stirred, a faint, cold touch that brushed against her cheek, as if something unseen listened. She did not know how long she knelt there, her whispers lost in the quiet, her tears slipping silently down her cheeks. But the stillness wrapped around her a soft, silent presence, a quiet comfort that seemed to touch her heart. And in that stillness, a faint, tiny spark of strength seemed to rise within her. A fragile light, but a light nonetheless. A flicker of resolve. When the ideal healer rose from her knees, the light of dawn touched her face, pale and cool. Her eyes were red with tears. Her hands still trembled, but there was something new in her gaze, a quiet, stubborn resolve. She returned to her cottage, her steps slow but steady. Her trembling hands moved among the jars, the dried herbs, the faded pages. But this time there was purpose in her touch. She brewed potions, crushed herbs, whispered charms that had once seemed like faint echoes. But now they were a promise that she would not give up. Her fingers wrapped dried lavender and rosemary, binding them with red thread. Not just herbs, but symbols of protection, of strength. She boiled water, steam rising in, a soft, fragrant mist, her voice a quiet murmur as she whispered ancient words, words of comfort, of courage, of hope. One by one the villagers came, pale faces at her door, whispered pleas. And she touched their hands, she whispered comfort, she wrapped their wrists with the fragrant herbs, pressing them gently, her voice calm, her eyes steady. I am here. I will not abandon you. Her touch was still gentle, her hands still trembled, but now there was strength in her voice. A quiet, unwavering strength that seemed to warm the cold air. The healer's garden still lay silent, the herbs still. Withered, but within her cottage the faint, warm light of the hearth seemed to grow. The shadows pressed against the walls, but they did not enter. And the healer, her hands trembling but strong, stood against the darkness. Chapter 6. The Wailing Night. Above the plague-ridden village, the night stretched out like a shroud, vast, silent, and unfeeling. The sky was a canvas of ink, punctuated by scattered stars, cold and distant. Their pale light shimmered, like icy pinpricks in the darkness, indifferent to the suffering below. The moon, a sickle of silver, hung low, casting its pale glow over the thatched roofs and crooked chimneys, illuminating the village with a ghostly light. The air was thick, heavy with a damp chill that seeped through the wooden walls of the cottages. The trees stood like silent sentinels, their twisted branches swaying gently, their leaves rustling with a whisper that seemed almost like a sigh. A mist had begun to creep in from the fields, curling around the houses, a silent spectre that moved with a life of its own. Inside the cramped homes, families watched the night with hollow eyes, fear etched into their faces. The silence was suffocating. But it was a silence that trembled, like the stillness before a storm. They knew the night brought no peace. For beyond the thin walls, beyond the feeble light of their dying fires, shadows danced. Shadows that were not just the darkness, but something far more menacing. The village seemed swallowed by a vast, indifferent sky, a tiny, helpless world under the gaze of cold, silent stars. The wind whispered through the narrow lanes, rustling the dried herbs hung outside the healer's cottage. It carried with it a chill that gnawed at the bones, a reminder that death was not a distant thought, but a lurking presence, creeping closer with each breath. Beneath the starlit sky, the village was nothing but a trembling speck, a flicker of life in a vast, indifferent darkness. The dying firelight within the cottages, fires burned low, their light flickering weakly against the walls. Shadows danced upon the rough wooden beams, twisting and curling like dark spirits. Families gathered close, their faces cast in a dim orange glow, but the light brought no warmth. It only served to deepen the hollows beneath their eyes, to sharpen the lines of worry etched upon their faces. Children leaned against their mothers, seeking comfort, but their mothers' arms were cold, trembling. Fathers stared into the fire, their faces grim and pale, lips murmuring quiet prayers, though even they seemed hollow. The fire's light reflected off metal, a cooking pot, a rusted blade, the pale sheen of an old, tarnished cross. Sacred objects held for comfort, but powerless against the creeping shadow that had settled upon the village. Now and then the fire would sputter, sending a brief spark that danced up the chimney, only to be swallowed by the darkness. The room would grow dimmer, the shadows stretching longer, clawing at the walls. There was a desperate battle in every flicker of light, a struggle against the dark that seemed eternal. A log shifted, collapsing with a dull crackle, sending a tiny shower of embers onto the hearth. But even the embers seemed to die too quickly, their brief glow snuffed out in the cold air. Faces leaned closer to the fire, eyes hungry for warmth, but the light was fading, and with it, so too was hope. In one cottage, a woman muttered softly, to herself, a whispered lullaby for a child already gone. In another, a man stirred the pot of thin gruel, though no one ate. The smell of sickness was everywhere, a sour, cloying scent that mingled with the smoke, lingering in the damp air. And outside, beyond the thin walls, the mist crept ever closer. Cries in the night began with a low, muffled wail, a sound that twisted through the silence like a thin, sorrowful thread. It came from the far edge of the village, where the cottages huddled close to the mist-shrouded fields. Then another cry echoed, sharp and desperate, piercing the night like a blade. The cries rose and fell, a chorus of suffering that seemed to pulse in the darkness. Mothers wept for their children, clutching small, feverish bodies against their chests. Old men groaned, their voices a low, hoarse rasp that seemed to claw at the air. Somewhere, a child's voice rose in a high, broken wail, only to be silenced abruptly. The darkness seemed to swallow the sound, but it left a haunting echo. Even the animals seemed to sense the despair. Dogs whimpered in their kennels, their ears pressed flat against their heads. Chickens rustled uneasily in their coops, feathers trembling with each sharp cry that shattered the stillness. A horse, tied to a post in the mist, snorted and stamped, eyes wild, its breath a faint, ghostly plume. The cries were not constant. They came in waves, each one rising with new desperation, then fading to a sickly, choking silence. And between the cries there was a stillness that was even more dreadful. A silence that seemed to listen, to wait. It was the silence of something vast and uncaring, the silence of the cold, silent stars above. In the narrow lanes, mist coiled, like ghostly fingers wrapping around the cottages, muffling the cries but never truly silencing them. And within the cottages the huddled families trembled, for the cries of the suffering were a reminder that death was not a distant shadow. It was here, moving among them. The healer's candle burns low at the edge of the village, where the trees whispered against the wind. The healer's cottage stood alone, its windows aglow with the faint, flickering light of a single candle. Inside, the healer, an old woman with silver hair and tired eyes, leaned over a worn wooden table cluttered with dried herbs, cracked vials, and withered roots. Her hands trembled slightly as she ground a mixture of leaves, her gaze fixed upon the candle's flame. It danced and wavered, a tiny, fragile light in the darkness. The healer's face was etched with lines of worry, her eyes shadowed with exhaustion. She had seen so many faces, so many lives that had slipped away beneath her touch. Her hands, once steady, were now marked with the faint stains of herbs and the trembling that came from too many sleepless nights. Beyond the thin walls, the cries of the suffering rose and fell, but here, in the healer's cottage, there was only the whisper of the flame and the soft rustle of leaves. Her gaze shifted to the window, where the mist pressed against the glass, a pale, ghostly sea. The candle's light seemed to fight against the darkness, but it was a battle it was losing. Her shadow danced upon the wall, long and thin, swaying with the flickering light. It seemed almost like a ghost, a reminder of how little time remained. The healer's breath was slow, heavy, and she whispered a prayer, not for a cure, for she knew there was none, but for peace, for the suffering to end. And as the candle burned lower, the flame shrinking, the healer leaned back, her gaze lost in the dying light. In her heart she knew this light too would soon be snuffed out, just like so many others. The night stretched on, the mist thickening, the cries rising and falling, the stars cold and silent above, and beneath their distant, indifferent light, the village trembled, a tiny, fragile world caught between shadow and flame, life and death, hope and despair. Chapter 7. The Hollow Dawn. Morning came, but it was a hollow, empty dawn. The pale light bled through a thick grey mist that clung to the earth like a ghostly shroud. In the fields beyond the village, the crops stood silent and still. Rows of withered stalks, their leaves curled and brown, hanging limp like forgotten memories. What once had been a sea of green, rustling with life and promise, was now a barren wasteland, cracked earth stretching beneath the cold sky. A chill breeze whispered through the dry stalks, causing them to sway weakly, a sound like the rattling of old bones. The soil beneath was hard, split by jagged fissures where the rain had refused to fall. Each breath of wind stirred dust, a pale, thin cloud that danced and then vanished. The sun was a pale disk, veiled behind thick clouds, its light feeble and distant. Birds no longer sang here. Their voices had fled with the green leaves, leaving only an empty, breathless silence. The crows that once gathered to peck at the ripe grain were gone, and in their place only the shadows of the bare trees reached out, clawing at the lifeless sky. In the far corner of the field, an old scarecrow still stood, its straw hat tilted, its once bright fabric now tattered and grey. Its empty sleeves flapped in the breeze, a hollow, hopeless gesture. There was no harvest left to protect, no seeds to save. It was a guardian of nothing, a silent witness to the slow decay that had swallowed the village. Beneath the weight of the mist, the land seemed to sigh, an endless, weary exhale, and the village, hunched at the edge of this dying field, stood, silent and still, a ghost town beneath the pale, unfeeling sky. The lonely church, steps in the heart of the village, the old stone church stood as a solemn sentinel. Its steeple rose into the mist, the weathered cross at its peak, a faint, shadowy outline. Once this place had been the soul of the village, its doors wide open, its pews filled with murmuring voices, and its walls echoing with the soft, warm glow of candlelight. But now it was an empty shell, a monument to silence, the great wooden doors were ajar, one hinge creaking softly as the wind nudged it. It swayed and groaned, a dull, haunting sound that carried through the mist. The steps leading up to the church were scattered with dried leaves, pale and brittle, blown here by the wind and left to gather in small, crumbling piles. No bells rang here anymore. The rope hung limp within the bell tower, swaying faintly with each gust. The altar, once adorned with fresh flowers and glowing candles, was now bare, its white cloth stained with dust. The stained glass windows, which had once cast vibrant colors across the floor, were now pale and dull, the light struggling to pierce through their dirt-smeared surface. And yet there was something even more sorrowful than the emptiness. It was the absence of footsteps. No children raced down the aisle, no whispered prayers broke the silence. Even the old priest who had once stood at the pulpit with a voice like a gentle breeze was gone. His place was an empty echo, his words lost to the mist. The wind whispered through the open door, swirling the leaves in a ghostly dance. It moved over the worn stone steps, leaving behind a cold, hollow chill. The village, once alive with faith and hope, now stood like a forgotten shrine, a place where even the light seemed hesitant to linger. A quiet hunger. Beyond the church, the village lanes twisted and wound through the mist, like pale, empty veins. The cottages huddled close, their thatched roofs bowed beneath the weight of damp, sagging straw. The windows were shut tight, the shutters creaking against the breeze. Smoke no longer rose from the chimneys, and the air carried the faint, sour scent of rot. Inside these darkened homes, hunger whispered. It was a quiet, gnawing presence, a hollow ache that wrapped itself around the empty stomachs of the villagers. The bread had gone stale, the meat had withered to dry scraps, and the vegetables were little more than shriveled husks. Families sat together in the dim light, their faces pale and drawn, their eyes shadowed with despair. Children leaned against their mothers, their thin faces pressed to hollow shoulders. A pot hung cold over the hearth, its surface blackened with soot, but empty of anything but the faint scent of old stew. A father reached into a cupboard, his hands trembling, as they brushed against nothing but a few dry herbs, a hard crust of bread turned to stone. Even the fields offered no promise. The earth was dry, the plants were dead, and the wild berries that once grew along the forest edge were gone. The forest itself seemed a place of shadows, the trees rising like silent sentinels, their branches twisted and barren. But hunger was not just a pain of the body. It was a heaviness that settled in the soul. It stole the strength from limbs, the hope from eyes. It turned whispers to silence, and silence to despair. And in the quiet corners of the cottages, where the wind whispered through the cracks, it seemed that even the air itself was empty. The healer's empty pouch in the dim light of her cottage, the healer sat by the window, her gnarled hands resting on her lap. Before her, the table was scattered with empty jars and dried, crumbling leaves, remnants of remedies that were no more. Her pouch, once filled with herbs and powders, now lay flat and empty, a hollow skin that rustled faintly in the breeze. She leaned forward, her weary eyes tracing the empty shelves. Here she had once kept her precious cures, the feverfew for pain, the chamomile for sleep, the mint for calming troubled breaths. But now there was nothing left. Even the faint scent of the herbs had faded, replaced by the stale, musty air. Her fingers trembled as she reached for a small glass vial, turning it in her hands. A single, dried leaf lay within, brittle and pale. It was a fragment of hope, a memory of what she had once offered. Comfort, healing, a brief escape from the darkness. But now her hands were empty, her knowledge a fading whisper. Beyond the window, the mist pressed against the glass, a pale, swirling sea that seemed to watch her with indifferent eyes. She could hear the soft sigh of the wind, the distant creak of the church door, the faint, muffled whispers of the village. But she could do nothing. Her touch, once a blessing, was now a ghost. Her voice, once soothing, was a thin, fragile breath. And so the healer sat, her shadow slumped against the wall, her pouch empty, her heart heavy. She whispered a prayer, not for a cure, for she knew there was none, but for an end. An end to the hunger, the suffering, the hollow silence that stretched across the village like a pale, endless dawn. The dawn continued to creep over the village, a pale, lifeless light spreading through the mist. The fields lay barren. The church stood empty. The homes were filled with quiet despair. And in the healer's cottage, her candles, flame guttered and died, leaving behind only a thin curl of smoke, rising and fading into the grey morning light. Chapter 8. The Wretched Procession. The mist clung to the village, a pale, ghostly veil that twisted and swirled with each faint breath of wind. Beneath its grey shroud, a line of silent figures moved slowly along the dirt path, a procession of the sick, the suffering, and the fading. Their footsteps were slow, each step a struggle, their shadows stretched long and thin upon the damp earth. Men, women, and children drifted forward, their faces pale, eyes hollow and dark. Some leaned on crude wooden canes, their hands trembling with each step. Others clung to one another, shoulders touching for a moment of shared warmth, a flicker of human connection in a world turned cold. Their clothes hung loose, the colours faded, their breath visible in the chill air. Thin, misty wisps that vanished as quickly as they appeared. Among them, a young boy limped, his thin fingers clutching his mother's shawl. His cheeks were flushed with fever, his eyes glassy, but his steps never faltered. Beside him, his mother whispered softly, her voice a thread of comfort, though her own strength seemed to wane with each word. An old man shuffled with a bent back, his gnarled hands gripping a staff, his gaze fixed upon the ground, as if each step were a trial. And there were those who were carried, frail bodies cradled in weary arms, heads resting against trembling shoulders. A father bore his daughter, her hair tangled and damp, her eyes closed, her breathing a faint, ragged whisper. A young girl helped her grandmother, their fingers intertwined, the elder's hand shaking with each step. The procession wound. Through the village, a quiet, endless line of shadows beneath the cold, pale sky. No one spoke, for there were no words left. Only the rustle of dry leaves underfoot, the soft crunch of damp earth, and the faint, hollow coughs that broke the stillness. Even the birds seemed to watch from the bare branches, their beady eyes dark and silent. The path stretched on, leading them toward the field's edge, where the mist thickened, a pale, swirling sea that swallowed the world. And yet they walked, as if drawn by some silent call, their faces pale and empty, their shadows melting into the mist. Beneath the silent sky, above them, the sky was a vast, heavy blanket of grey. Clouds pressed together, thick and unyielding, their shadows spreading across the village like a mourning veil. The light was pale, almost silver, a cold, distant glow that cast a faint, ghostly sheen upon the withered fields and twisted trees. The air was still, save for the occasional whisper of wind that stirred the leaves and brushed against the faces of the procession. But even the wind seemed weak, a feeble breath that carried a damp, musty scent. The smell of earth left untouched, of wood grown dark with rot. The world felt small beneath that silent sky, the village a lonely speck swallowed by the mist. crow cawed in the distance, its voice a sharp, lonely cry that seemed to echo, then fade. In the treetops the branches swayed, their bare fingers reaching out like pleading hands. But the sky offered nothing, no sun to warm the faces of the weary, no rain to cleanse the dusty earth, only an endless cold shadow. The villagers moved like ghosts, their steps muffled, their figures pale against the grey light. Some reached out to touch the damp leaves as they passed, their fingers brushing against the wet, cold surface. A faint, empty gesture, a memory of life once felt. Others lifted their faces to the sky, their lips parting as if to speak, but no words came. Only the wind, a quiet sigh, whispered in answer. Above, the clouds shifted, their dark shapes swirling, a slow, restless dance that blotted out the heavens. There were no stars, no blue, only an endless grey void that seemed to press down, heavy and cold. The sky watched, silent and indifferent, as the wretched procession drifted on. A mother's last embrace? Midway along the path, a woman stumbled, her knees buckling beneath her. Her arms clung desperately to a small child pressed against her chest, his body hot and trembling. His eyes fluttered, half closed, a faint, weak breath slipping from his lips. The woman's fingers brushed the damp curls from his forehead, her touch light and trembling. "Stay with me," she whispered, her voice breaking. Her tears mingled with the mist, falling softly upon his fevered cheeks. His tiny hands clutched weakly at her shawl, his head resting against her shoulder, his breath growing softer, each rise and fall a struggle. Her arms were frail, thin as the bare branches above. But she held him with all the strength she had, her fingers gripping his small frame, her cheek pressed to his burning forehead. Around her the procession moved on, shadowed figures drifting past without a word, their faces turned away, their own sorrows too heavy to bear another's. But she did not see them. Her world had shrunk to this one fragile life, this tiny heartbeat, fluttering against her chest, fading with each passing moment. The mist seemed to close in, a pale, swirling blanket that wrapped around them, muffling the distant cries, the rustling leaves, even the cold wind's touch. His hand fell limp against her shoulder. His breath, so faint, faded into stillness. For a moment her eyes remained closed, her lips pressed to his brow, whispering words too quiet to hear. Her tears fell silently, her arms tightening, holding him as if to keep his spirit from drifting away. But the world was quiet now. And when she finally looked up, her eyes hollow, she saw only the grey mist and the endless, silent sky. The procession moved on, its shadows stretching away, but she did not follow. She knelt there, her arms around the empty weight in her embrace, a statue of sorrow beneath the cold, pale light. The healer's final plea, from the edge of her cottage. The healer stood, her thin frame wrapped in a faded shawl. Her silver hair stirred faintly in the wind, her eyes dark and weary as she watched the procession pass. Her hands, once steady and strong, now trembled, empty, powerless. She whispered words beneath her breath, her voice a quiet, desperate murmur. Prayers, please. 100 tiny wishes cast into the cold, unfeeling air. She had tried. She had mixed herbs, whispered healing words, laid cool cloths upon burning brows, but now her herbs were gone, her touch a ghost, her hope a thin, fragile thread. Mercy. Please, mercy, she whispered, her fingers clasped together, her knuckles pale beneath the withered skin. Her gaze wandered over the faces of the procession, the pale, fevered children, the stooped elders with their sunken eyes, the mothers who carried silent bundles, their tears lost in the mist. They did not see her. They drifted on, their faces turned to the grey, endless mist, their footsteps slow and weary. The healer's voice rose, a thin, cracking whisper that vanished into the air. She reached out, as if to touch them, but her fingers grasped only emptiness. The wind stirred, a cold breath that brushed against her cheek, catching the edges of her shawl. Her shadow stretched upon the misty path, long and thin, and then faded into the grey. Her whispered pleas were swallowed by the silence, her prayers scattered like dry leaves. The procession passed, the mist thickened, and the healer's voice grew quiet, lost to the wind. And as the last shadow drifted into the mist, she leaned against the doorway, her gaze empty, her whispered words dying upon her lips. The village lay beneath the heavy, silent sky. The procession wound on, pale shadows lost in the mist, their faces drawn, their eyes hollow. And in the stillness, the healer stood alone, her pleas a fading whisper, her hope a thin, fragile spark swallowed by the grey, indifferent light. Chapter 9. The Sound of Mourning. It began with a low, heavy sound, a deep, mournful chime that seemed to ripple through the mist like a distant, sorrowful whisper. The church bell tolled, its voice slow and hollow, each chime a soft echo that drifted over the empty fields, through the silent lanes, and across the cold, shivering rooftops of the village. The bell's sound was not loud, but it was heavy. It seemed to hang in the damp air, lingering, wrapping around the thatched cottages and seeping into the narrow, twisting paths. Each chime was a heartbeat, a slow, solemn pulse that spoke of loss, of names whispered and then forgotten, of empty chairs and faded laughter. High in the belfry, the old rusted bell swung gently, its voice muffled by the mist. The rope, thick and frayed, rose and fell with the slow, steady pull of a figure below. The bell-ringer, a hunched old man with a weary face, his hands trembling with each tug. His eyes stared into the grey void beyond the arched window, where the sky was a blank, cold expanse, an ocean of pale grey stretching forever. Around him the wind stirred, fluttering the loose corners of his cloak. His fingers gripped the rough rope, his knuckles pale against the dark, damp wood. He did not count the tolls, and there was no need. Each chime was the same, a low, lingering call that drifted through the village, a voice for those who could no longer speak. And beneath that sound, the village seemed to pause, its breath caught between the tolls. No laughter, no songs, no whispered conversations, only the slow, heavy tolling of the bell, each chime a fading echo, each silence that followed a hollow ache. It was a voice of sorrow, a voice of mourning that wrapped the village in a shroud of quiet despair. The empty paths below, the bell tower, the village paths twisted like pale, narrow ribbons through the mist. They wound between the cottages, past the faded gardens and leaning fences, stretching out toward the barren fields and the shadowed forest beyond. But now they were empty. The wind whispered down the lanes, a soft, sighing breath that stirred the fallen leaves, sending them swirling in slow, ghostly dances. Leaves, once green and full of life, were now pale and dry, their edges curled and brittle. They gathered in the corners of doorsteps, drifted against crumbling walls, and skittered across the cold, damp stones. There was no laughter here, no hurried footsteps, no playful shouts of children racing through the narrow lanes. The marketplace, once alive with the calls of merchants and the soft murmur of neighbors exchanging words, was silent. The stalls stood empty, their wooden frames leaning like tired old men, their cloth canopies sagging and torn. In the center of the square, the old fountain murmured weakly, a thin trickle of water that barely whispered against the moss-covered stones. Its voice was a faint, hollow sound, lost in the vast quiet that pressed down upon the village. The mist curled through the paths, a pale, swirling presence that seemed to watch with cold, indifferent eyes. It clung to the rooftops, drifted between the trees, wrapped itself around the empty benches and the cold, forgotten well. It was as though the mist itself were a shroud, a pale veil draped over a village that had become a ghost of its former self. And in that silence, beneath the tolling of the distant bell, the empty paths seemed to whisper of those who had walked them. Shadows of laughter, faint echoes of voices now lost, memories fading like mist beneath the cold, grey light. Faces behind the windows, in the cottages, where the thin light struggled to pierce the gloom, pale faces peered from behind fogged glass. Curtains, once brightly coloured, now hung heavy and still, their edges yellowed with damp. Fingers curled around the fabric, pulling it just wide enough for weary eyes to stare into the mist-shrouded lanes. Children pressed their faces to the cold glass, their breaths leaving faint, misty patches that slowly faded. Their eyes were wide, searching the empty paths, watching the leaves twist and dance in the breeze. But there was nothing beyond the window but shadows and silence. Mothers stood close behind them, their faces pale, their lips pressed into thin, silent lines. They watched with quiet dread, their hands resting on the thin shoulders of their children, a gentle, trembling touch. Fathers leaned in the dim corners, their gazes fixed upon the empty paths, their fingers tapping nervously against the wooden frames. In one cottage, an old woman stared from her window, her grey hair loose around her shoulders, her fingers brushing the cold glass. Her eyes were clouded with tears, but her lips moved in a silent prayer. She had lost so much, so many faces now gone, and yet she stared, hoping to see a shadow, a flicker of life returning along the path. In another, a young boy stared at the empty street, his small hands pressed against the glass. His sister, a pale, fevered shadow beneath the thin blanket, lay on the bed behind him, her breathing shallow. His mother's voice was a faint, whispered hum, a song she sang with trembling lips, her gaze never leaving her child. The mist seemed to press against. The windows, a pale, swirling wall that wrapped the village in its cold, silent embrace. And behind those windows, the villagers watched, their pale faces and wide eyes like ghosts trapped behind the thin, fragile glass. The healer's quiet, tears, in the shadowed corner of her small, cluttered cottage. The healer sat alone. Her hands lay motionless in her lap, her fingers curled like the dry, withered leaves that scattered across the cold, cracked floor. Her eyes were dark and heavy, her gaze fixed upon the pale flicker of the candle's flame. It danced weakly, a thin golden thread of light that swayed with each faint breath of air. It was the last of her candles, a tiny flame in a world of shadows, a fragile spark that seemed ready to vanish at any moment. And as she stared, her eyes grew wet, tears welling and spilling silently down her cheeks. Her heart was a heavy, aching weight, each slow beat a dull, hollow throb. She had tried. She had whispered soft prayers, mixed her herbs, touched fevered brows with a gentle hand. But the sickness had swept through the village like a pale, cold wind, stealing away faces she had once known, shadows that had once smiled. Her shelves were empty now, her pouches crumpled and dry. The herbs that once filled her cottage with a sweet, healing scent were gone, their leaves crumbled to dust. The whispered chants, the careful brews, they had become empty rituals, desperate gestures against an unrelenting darkness. Her tears fell, tracing thin, pale lines down her cheeks. They dripped onto her hands, her fingers twitching beneath their cold, wet touch. She whispered names. Names of those she could not save, names of those whose eyes she had closed for the last time. Her voice was a faint, broken murmur, a quiet confession of helplessness. The candle's flame flickered, a soft, trembling light that seemed to waver beneath the weight of her grief. It danced, then stilled, then danced again, a tiny golden spark against the deepening shadows. And as the mist pressed against her window, cold and pale, the healer's tears fell in silence, her whispered prayers fading to nothing. The village lay beneath the grey, silent sky. The bell tolled, its voice a slow, sorrowful whisper that drifted through the mist. The paths were empty, the windows shadowed, and in her darkened cottage the healer wept, her quiet tears a soft, unspoken song of sorrow. Sorrow. Chapter 10. The Lonely Graves. The morning was a pale, cold hush, a grey mist that wrapped itself around the village, curling through the empty lanes and settling like a shroud upon the graveyard. Beneath that heavy sky, a figure moved slowly, a dark shape against the withered grass, his steps heavy, his face hidden beneath the shadow of a wide-brimmed hat. The gravedigger worked in silence. His hands were rough, the skin cracked and stained with earth. His shovel bit into the cold, damp soil, each thrust a soft, muffled sound that seemed swallowed by the mist. Dirt crumbled, dark and heavy, falling in silent clumps to the side, filling the quiet air with a faint, earthy scent. His breath rose in faint, misty clouds, each exhale a thin whisper that faded almost as quickly as it appeared. Beneath the brim of his hat, his eyes were shadowed, tired and hollow. He did not look up, his gaze fixed upon the ground, each shovelful of earth a quiet, solemn task. The graveyard stretched around him, a field of small mounds marked with crude wooden crosses, their surfaces bare, the names carved with rough, uneven lines. Some of the graves bore faded flowers, their petals browned and curling, while others were marked with simple stones, their rough edges moss-covered and damp. The gravedigger's hands moved with a slow, steady rhythm. He dug and he filled, each grave a silent wound in the earth, each mound a whispered farewell. There was no ceremony, no songs, no prayers, only the faint rustle of the mist among the grass and the soft, rhythmic scrape of the shovel. But beneath his quiet, methodical work there was a weight, a sorrow that clung to his shoulders, that pressed against his chest with each breath. He knew their faces, each one he buried, faces that had once smiled, that had once spoken his name. Friends, neighbors, a sister, a child. The earth swallowed them, and he stood above, a silent witness to their vanishing. His hands trembled faintly as he lifted another shovelful, and his gaze lingered for a moment upon the empty, open grave, a hollow shadow beneath the grey sky. Then he lowered his head, and his work continued, his silence unbroken, his shadow a still, lonely figure in the mist. A field of shadows, the village graveyard stretched beneath the pale, unyielding sky, a silent garden of sorrow. The mist wove between the narrow rows, its pale tendrils curling around the crude crosses and weathered stones. Here, beneath the cold, empty sky, the dead lay quiet, their stories buried beneath the earth, their voices lost to the wind. Fresh mounds rose among the older graves, small, rounded hills of dark earth, their surfaces damp, their edges soft and crumbling. The wooden markers, hastily carved, bore names now barely visible, the letters fading beneath the touch of rain and mist. Some of the crosses leaned at awkward angles, their bases sinking slowly into the soil. Leaves dry and brittle whispered across the ground, stirred by the faint, cold breeze. They scattered like pale ghosts brushing against the graves, their thin, curling edges catching for a moment before drifting on. The trees, tall and bare, stood like silent sentinels, their twisted branches reaching out, clawing at the pale sky. There was no path here, no fence, only the slow, steady spread of the graves, a quiet sea of sorrow beneath the mist. The shadows stretched, pale and thin, dancing with the soft, shivering light. Even the birds seemed to avoid this place, their voices lost, their wings silent. But within this silent field there was a quiet ache, a feeling that lingered in the air, pressing against the chest, a whisper of loss that seemed to hum in the stillness. Each grave was a memory, each name a story, now written in the cold earth, now whispered to the mist. The grave-digger moved among them, his steps slow, his shadow merging with the thin, misty shapes. And as he passed, the earth seemed to sigh, the wind brushing against the markers, a faint, whispered song that rose and fell, like a lullaby for the forgotten. Prayers in the wind, from the edge of the graveyard, the priest's voice rose, a faint, wavering murmur that drifted through the mist. His words were soft, carried by the wind, a quiet chant that seemed almost swallowed by the silence. His robes, dark and tattered, fluttered gently in the cold breeze, his fingers wrapped around a worn wooden cross. He stood beneath a gnarled, ancient tree, its bare branches reaching out above him like twisted fingers. His head was bowed, his lips moving in slow, steady rhythm, his voice a whisper that seemed to vanish even as it was spoken. There were no crowds here, no grieving families gathered close, only the graves, silent and still, the mist swirling at their feet. "Grant them peace. Grant them rest," he whispered, his voice a thin thread against the wind. His eyes were closed, his face pale beneath the shadow of his hood. He whispered names. Names of those he had seen, those he had blessed, those whose eyes he had closed with trembling fingers. The wind caught his words, tugging at them, scattering them among the leaves and the cold, silent stones. It was a prayer lost to the mist, a plea that seemed to fade with each breath. Yet he whispered on, his fingers tightening around the cross, his voice a quiet, desperate hope cast into the empty air. The gravedigger paused, his shovel resting against the damp earth, his gaze lifting toward the priest. He did not speak, but, for a moment, their eyes met. Two shadows in a world of grey, two souls wrapped in quiet sorrow. The priest's voice grew faint, his chant a fading echo, and then he fell silent. His head remained bowed, his fingers tracing the worn edges of the cross. The wind whispered around him, a faint, cold breath that brushed against his cheeks, catching his words and carrying them away. The healer's flowers as the mist curled, and the cold wind sighed. The healer walked slowly among the graves. Her hands, thin and trembling, carried a small bundle of wildflowers. Pale blossoms plucked from the forest's edge, their petals soft and delicate, their faint scent a whisper of life in a world of shadows. She knelt beside a fresh grave, her fingers brushing against the dark, damp earth. Her touch was gentle, her eyes heavy with tears that did not fall, her lips pressed into a thin, silent line. She laid the flowers upon the mound, their pale petals a soft splash of color against the cold, brown soil. One by one she moved, her slow, quiet steps leaving faint marks in the damp grass. Her hands placed flowers upon the graves, a silent promise, a quiet remembrance. Some she knew, names that echoed in her memory, faces that lingered in her thoughts. Others were strangers, but she placed flowers just the same, her touch a gentle whisper of care. The wind stirred her silver hair, brushing it against her pale cheeks, her gaze drifting toward the mist-shrouded sky. She whispered softly, words too faint to hear, her fingers tracing the names carved into the rough, wooden markers. This was all she had left to give, a few pale blossoms, a quiet touch, a whispered prayer that danced upon the wind. Her remedies were gone. Her touch could no longer heal, but she could remember. She could offer this simple, silent promise that they would not be forgotten. And as she moved among the graves, her shadow stretched long and thin, mingling with the mist. Her flowers lay scattered, pale petals swaying gently, their soft colors a fragile breath of life in this quiet garden of sorrow. The mist thickened, the grey sky pressed close, and the village graveyard stretched beneath it. A field of silent shadows, a garden of quiet whispers. The grave-digger's hands moved in slow, steady rhythm, the priest's voice faded upon the wind, and the healer's flowers lay soft upon the cold, dark earth. And there, in that quiet place, beneath the endless pale sky, the village is lost. Unrested, remembered by whispers, by petals, by silent tears. Tears. Chapter 11. Whispers of Guilt. It began with whispers, faint, drifting murmurs that slipped through the misty air, like shadows curling through the narrow lanes of the village. At first, they were little more than quiet sighs, hushed, words exchanged behind closed doors, beneath the cover of darkness. But soon the whispers grew louder, sharp and bitter, clawing at the thin walls of the cottages. The villagers moved with downcast eyes, their faces pale, their steps slow and weary. But behind their empty gazes, fear twisted into something darker. They spoke of curses, of hidden sins, of shadows that brought the sickness. Fingers were pointed, first in secrecy, then in trembling anger. Neighbors who once shared bread now watched one another with narrowed eyes, their words laced with suspicion. She is always alone, always whispering to herself. An old woman murmured to her daughter, her voice a thin, trembling hiss. And the herbs she gives, they never help. Perhaps it is her doing. A man leaned against the shadowed wall of his cottage, his eyes darting toward the healer's hut, a dark shape shrouded in mist. The sickness came after she arrived, he whispered, his voice low and heavy. Perhaps she is not what she seems. Mothers clutched their children close, their fingers tight against small shoulders, their eyes flicking nervously toward the healer's path. Fathers turned away, their faces pale, their voices hushed, speaking of curses, of dark arts, of whispered spells that brought suffering. The mist seemed to thicken, pressing against the narrow lanes, curling around the rooftops, muffling the quiet, bitter murmurs. Shadows stretched beneath the pale grey light, thin and clawed, reaching toward the shuttered windows, slipping beneath the crooked doors. And in the cold, still air, suspicion festered like a wound. The village, once a place of shared sorrows and whispered prayers, now seemed a place of hidden fear, a place where eyes watched from the darkness, where whispers danced like ghosts, where even the wind seemed to carry a faint, accusing sigh. The healer's accusation, the healer felt the whispers before she heard them. They pressed against her door like a cold, unseen weight, a suffocating silence that wrapped around her small cottage. The villagers no longer came seeking her help. No more quiet knocks, no more trembling hands reaching for her herbs. Her shelves stood empty, the air cold and still. When she stepped outside, the world seemed to draw away. Mothers hurried their children indoors, the shutters closed with a soft, hurried thud. Men turned their faces, their eyes dark and wary. And from the shadows, the whispers rose. She promised healing. But they died, someone muttered, their voice low, laced with bitterness. She speaks to the wind, mixes strange herbs. "It is not natural," another voice whispered, the words curling like smoke. The healer's steps grew slower, her shoulders heavy beneath the pale, sagging shawl that draped her thin frame. Her fingers, once steady and strong, now trembled as she reached for the wildflowers that grew by the roadside. But even the flowers seemed pale, their petals brittle beneath her touch. One evening, as the cold mist thickened around the village, a small stone struck the wall of her cottage. It landed with a dull, heavy thud, rolling to a stop at her doorstep. She looked up, but the path was empty, the mist swirling in silent, ghostly patterns. And then the words came, sharp, angry, whispers carried by the wind. Witch, curse-bringer. Death follows her. The darkness seemed to press close, the mist a pale, swirling sea that wrapped around her small, hunched figure. The healer's hands clasped together, her fingers tightening, her breath a faint, shivering mist. Her gaze fell to the cold earth, her shadow stretched long and thin beneath the pale grey sky. And as she turned back to her darkened cottage, her heart ached with a quiet, helpless sorrow. A cry in the night had settled upon the village, thick and heavy. The mist coiled through the narrow lanes, a pale, swirling blanket that wrapped itself around the cottages, muffling the faint, distant sounds. But beneath that quiet shroud, fear had taken root, twisting in the hearts of the weary villagers. Then in the darkness, a sudden glow burst to life, a sharp, angry light that rose against the mist, orange and fierce. Flames danced, their pale, golden tongues licking at the darkened sky. A cottage burned, its thatched roof crackling, the dry straw catching with a sharp, hungry roar. Shadows danced upon the mist, flickering shapes that stretched and twisted. Voices rose, sharp and desperate, mingling with the crackle of the flames. "She cursed us!" someone shouted, their voice a thin, frantic wail. "Her touch brings death! Her whispers are poison!" A figure stumbled from the burning cottage, a woman's pale face caught in the glow, her eyes wide with terror, her hands reaching out, grasping for something, for someone. But the shadows surged around her, their voices sharp, their faces twisted with fear. She brought the sickness. Another voice screamed, "Burn it! Burn the curse away!" The fire roared, its light a wild, dancing fury. Smoke rose, a thick, dark plume that twisted and coiled, blotting out the pale stars. The wind caught the ashes, scattering them, faint, dark specks that drifted through the mist, settling upon the cold, damp earth. And when the flames finally faded, their light a dying glow, the village was silent. Only the mist remained, curling through the charred remains, a pale, ghostly sea beneath the cold, indifferent skies. The healer's solitude, the healer walked alone, her steps slow and quiet, Her shadow stretched long beneath the grey, empty sky. The mist curled around her, a pale, swirling shroud that clung to her thin frame, her breath a faint, misty whisper in the cold air. Her path wound through the silent lanes, past the shuttered windows, past the cold, empty gardens where the withered stalks swayed faintly in the breeze. The village seemed to turn away, its eyes closed, its whispers a faint, bitter echo. The healer's cottage stood at the edge of the village, its small, dark shape shrouded in mist. The flowers that once grew by her door had withered, their petals curled and brown. The herbs that hung beneath the eaves were dry and crumbling, their faint, sweet scent a distant memory. Her hands, once steady and gentle, now trembled, her fingers curling beneath the pale, tattered shawl that draped her shoulders. Her gaze wandered to the empty path, to the cold, grey light that pressed against the village, a pale, endless sea. She whispered to herself, her voice a faint, broken murmur, prayers, quiet thoughts, names of faces she had once touched, lives she had tried to save. But now her touch was feared, her voice a curse, her shadow a sign of death. The mist thickened, pressing close, curling around her feet, rising like a pale, swirling wave. Her steps slowed, her gaze fixed upon the cold, damp earth. She was a shadow among shadows, a faint, flickering shape lost in the mist. And as the wind whispered, brushing against her pale cheeks, she closed her eyes, her breath a soft, quiet sigh. The village was a place of whispers now, whispers of fear, of blame, of sorrow, and the healer, once a touch of comfort, had become a shadow, a quiet, lonely figure in the mist. The village lay beneath the cold, grey sky. The mist curled through the empty lanes, pale and silent. And within that ghostly silence, the whispers lingered, faint, bitter echoes that danced like shadows, twisting through the cold air, pressing against the hearts of those who remained. And the healer, a shadow among shadows, walked alone. Chapter 12. A Quiet Madness. The mist hung low over the village, a pale, ghostly sea that curled around the rooftops, drifted through the lanes, and brushed against the bare branches of the twisted trees. Beneath this shroud of grey, Andikyo, old man wandered, his steps slow, his figure a faint, shuffling shadow against the mist. His hair, once dark and thick, was now a thin silver wisp that fluttered in the cold breeze. His clothes hung loose on his thin frame, the fabric worn and frayed, his shoes caked with mud. But it was his eyes, pale, clouded, empty, that spoke of a world lost, a mind adrift. He walked in circles, his path winding aimlessly through the narrow lanes, his gaze fixed on something distant, something unseen. His lips moved, a faint, whispering murmur that twisted through the mist, a soft, broken song of forgotten words. "Gone! They're all gone!" "Shadows in the mist," he whispered, his voice a thin, hollow thread. "I saw them. I saw them vanish." His hands reached out, grasping at the empty air, fingers curling and uncurling like dry leaves caught in the wind. Sometimes he would pause, his head tilting, as though listening to some distant voice, his eyes widening, his breath a thin, shivering mist. "They spoke to me." From the shadows. They whispered. His voice trembled, his fingers tightening around nothing. "But I couldn't save them." He wandered on, his slow, shuffling steps leaving faint, muddy prints in the damp earth. His whispers twisted through the narrow lanes, a quiet, broken song that seemed to drift with the mist, a voice lost in a world of pale, empty shadows. Once he paused before an empty cottage, his gaze lingering upon the dark, shuttered windows. His voice softened, his hand reaching out, brushing against the cold, rough wood. "Anna," he whispered, his voice a faint, hopeful breath, but there was only silence. And then he turned, his steps slow and weary, his whispers rising once more, a thin, broken murmur swallowed by the mist. The shuttered cottage, beneath the pale, grey sky, one cottage stood dark and silent, its door shut tight, its windows hidden behind thick, faded curtains. From within, a faint murmur drifted, a quiet, nervous hum, a whispered storm of fear that pressed against the cold, damp walls. Inside, a family huddled close, their faces pale, their eyes wide and shadowed. The father sat by the door, his shoulders hunched, his hands gripping the rough wooden bar that locked them in. His gaze darted between the faint lines of light that slipped through the window's edge, his breath a slow, heavy sigh. Beside him, his wife whispered, her voice a thin, trembling thread. "It's out there. It's everywhere," she murmured, her fingers clasped tightly around a small, faded rosary. "The mist, it brings it. It seeps through the walls." Her words twisted around the small room, a quiet storm that seemed to echo in the shadows. The children leaned against her, their small bodies pressed close, their faces buried against her shawl. They whispered too, faint, broken words, questions with no answers, fears too heavy for their young hearts. "It come for us?" a boy whispered, his voice a thin, frightened breath. "Hush, child, hush," the mother murmured, her fingers brushing through his tangled hair. "We are safe. We are safe." But the father's gaze did not leave the door. His hands tightened against the wooden bar, his knuckles pale beneath the strain. His breath came slow, heavy, each exhale a faint, misty cloud that hung in the cold air. Beyond the thin walls the wind sighed, a soft, ghostly whisper that seemed to brush against the shutters, to curl beneath the door. The mist pressed against the glass, a pale, swirling sea that seemed to watch, silent and cold. Inside, the whispers twisted on, a faint, nervous hum that rose and fell, that mingled with the soft creak of the wooden beams, the faint rustle of the curtain. And in that small, dark room, fear grew thick, a quiet madness that seemed to press against the air, a shadow that wrapped itself around the quiet, trembling family. The healer's haunted eyes, at the edge of the village, the healer stood alone, her thin frame wrapped in a faded shawl, her silver hair stirring faintly in the cold breeze. Her eyes, once clear and gentle, were now shadowed, dark circles etched beneath them, her gaze distant and hollow. She stood by her cottage door, her hands clasped before her, her fingers trembling slightly. She stared at the empty path that wound. Through the mist, her breath a faint, misty sigh that faded into the pale, swirling air. Faces seemed to drift through her thoughts, faces she had touched with trembling fingers, whispered prayers she had offered to the wind, names that twisted in her mind, slipping through her memory like shadows. I tried to save them," she whispered, her voice a faint, broken murmur. "But they slipped away, all of them, slipping into the mist." She did not sleep, not truly. Her nights were a restless haze, her eyes staring at the flickering flame of her last candle, her mind a tangled web of memories, of whispered voices, of outstretched hands that vanished like smoke. The wind stirred, a cold breath that brushed against her cheeks, that whispered through the bare branches above. She watched the path, empty and silent, her heart heavy, her breath slow and aching. Sometimes she thought she saw them, shadows drifting through the mist, faint shapes that seemed to turn, to whisper her name. But when she reached out, her fingers touched only the cold, empty air. Her eyes stung, tears that never truly fell, a faint, quiet ache that seemed to settle deep within her chest. And as the mist thickened, curling around her feet, she whispered again, faint, broken prayers that twisted away, that drifted into the pale, empty air. A faint glimmer of hope. The mist was thick, a pale, silent sea that wrapped around the village, pressing against the silent cottages, curling through the empty lanes. But then, like a faint, fragile breath, a small, bright colour caught the healer's eye. A child, no more than 7, stepped from the mist, her hair a tangled mess, her cheeks pale, but her eyes wide and clear. She walked toward the healer, her tiny steps leaving faint, damp prints in the grass. In her small hand, she held a single wildflower, its pale yellow petals bright against the cold grey air. She stepped close, her small fingers reaching out, the flower held high, her gaze fixed upon the healer's shadowed face. "This is for you," the child whispered, her voice a soft, clear note against the silence. The healer stared, her eyes wide, her breath caught in her chest. Her trembling fingers reached out, brushing against the soft, delicate petals. The touch was warm, a faint, gentle whisper of life. Tears filled her eyes, her voice a faint, broken whisper. "Thank you. Oh, child, thank you." The child smiled, a small, soft curve of her lips, and then turned, her small figure slipping back into the mist, her pale shadow vanishing beneath the swirling grey. The healer stood, her fingers clasped. Around the tiny flower, its soft petals a gentle touch against her cold, trembling hands. And as the mist curled around her, as the wind whispered through the bare branches, her eyes softened, a faint, quiet warmth stirring within her heart. Wildflower, a tiny, fragile breath of life in a world of grey shadows, a promise, a whisper of hope. The village lay beneath the cold, grey sky, the mist twisting through the empty lanes, the wind sighing against the silent cottages. But in the healer's trembling hands, the wildflower bloomed, a faint, fragile spark in the darkness, a quiet promise that whispered of life, of hope, of a world beyond the mist. Chapter 13. The Return of Faith. The village lay beneath the heavy grey sky, shrouded in mist, the air cold and damp. Silence pressed against the narrow lanes, a stillness that seemed almost heavy, as if the very air held its breath. But then a soft, golden glow flickered in the darkness, a warm, trembling light that spilled out from the old church. The great wooden doors, which had stood closed and silent for so long, now stood open. A faint, warm light stretched across the cold, misty square, a soft, golden path that seemed to beckon, to welcome. The glow came from a row of candles, their tiny flames swaying gently, a line of fragile lights that flickered against the thick, grey air. The wind stirred, a cold breath that swept through the square, but the candles did not waver. Their light shimmered, casting a soft, golden warmth that reached out toward the empty paths, a quiet whisper of hope in a world of shadows. The stone walls of the church seemed to come alive beneath the glow. The stained glass windows, once dull and grey, now shone with faint, muted colors, the faint images of saints and angels glowing softly in the candlelight. The air within was warm, a gentle hush that seemed to embrace, to comfort. One by one, the villagers began to appear, shadows emerging from the mist, drawn to the light like lost souls seeking warmth. They stepped into the square, their faces pale, their eyes wide and tired. Mothers held the hands of their children, fathers walked with bowed heads, their breaths misting in the cold air. They stood at the church door, their faces caught in the soft, golden glow, their shadows stretching behind them, thin and dark. For a moment, they simply watched, their eyes drawn to the gentle dance of the flames, the warm light that seemed to whisper of something beyond the mist. A quiet, fragile promise. And then, slowly, they stepped inside. The warmth embraced them. The light washed over their pale faces, and the cold seemed to melt away, leaving only a quiet, peaceful hush. The priest's soft voice within the church, the air was warm, the soft glow of the candles casting gentle golden light upon the rough stone walls. The villagers filled the pews, their faces turned toward the altar, their eyes fixed upon the quiet figure who stood beneath the soft, glowing cross. The priest, his robes dark, but his face calm, raised his hands, his voice a gentle, soothing murmur that drifted through the quiet space. His words were simple, soft, a prayer spoken not with grand, commanding tones, but with the faint, quiet strength of a whisper. "Grant them peace. Grant them rest," he murmured, his voice a gentle breeze that brushed against the silent hearts of those who listened. "In the darkness, let your light guide them. In sorrow, let your love embrace them." His words rose and fell, a slow, steady rhythm, like the soft whisper of the wind through the trees. There was no grandeur here, no loud hymns, no grand gestures, only a quiet, soothing voice that seemed to wash over the gathered souls, a gentle wave that eased the sharp ache of grief. Some bowed their heads, their hands clasped, their lips moving in quiet prayers of their own. Others simply sat, their eyes closed, their breath slowing, their faces touched by the soft, golden light. The wind sighed against the stained glass windows, a faint, hollow whisper that seemed distant, weak. But within the church the candles flickered, their light steady, warm. The priest's voice rose once more, his words a gentle, comforting touch. "Though the mist surrounds us, though the shadows press close, there is a light that never fades, a warmth that never dies." And in the quiet glow of the candles, beneath the soft, soothing voice of the priest, the cold seemed to fade, the shadows seemed to draw back, and the quiet ache that had gripped the village began to ease, if only for a moment. The healer's quiet prayer in the soft glow of the candlelight. The healer knelt, her thin frame wrapped in a faded shawl, her silver hair falling like pale threads against her face. Her hands were clasped, her fingers trembling, her breath a faint, quiet whisper in the warm air. Her eyes, shadowed with exhaustion, stared at the flickering flame before her, a small, golden light that danced gently, casting a soft glow upon her weary face. She did not speak at first, her lips pressed together, her gaze lost in the warm, gentle light. But then her voice rose, a faint, broken whisper that seemed to drift through the quiet church, a whisper only the candles seemed to hear. I tried so hard," she whispered, her fingers tightening, her shoulders trembling. "I whispered prayers, I mixed herbs, I held their hands, but they slipped away. They slipped into the mist. Her tears fell, tracing pale lines down her cheeks, her breath shivering. She leaned closer, her forehead touching the rough, cold stone of the altar step, her whispered voice fading to a faint, quiet murmur. Please, grant them peace, grant them rest, and forgive me, for my helpless hands, for the lives I could not save. The light shimmered, a soft, warm glow that seemed to dance with her whispered words, a gentle, silent comfort. Her tears fell, her breath a soft, broken sigh, but the ache in her chest seemed to ease, her heart a little less heavy, and as the warmth wrapped around her, as the soft glow touched her face, she whispered once more, a quiet, trembling promise. I will remember them. I will carry their names. I will keep their light alive. The flame danced, a gentle, golden spark that seemed to smile, a soft, warm whisper of peace. And beneath that light, the healer's tears fell, her whispered prayer drifting through the quiet, warm air. A village united in faith. The church was warm now, a soft, golden glow that spilled from the open doors, stretching out into the misty square. Within, the villagers stood close, their hands clasped, their faces touched by the warm, gentle light. No one spoke, but there was a quiet strength in their silence, a stillness that seemed to hum with quiet hope. The priest's voice rose, again a gentle, soft murmur, a prayer that drifted through the warm air. Mothers held the hands of their children, fathers stood with bowed heads, their eyes closed, their lips moving in quiet whispers. The healer stood among them, her hands folded, her gaze fixed upon the soft, glowing candles. Her tears had dried, but her heart was warm, her breath slow and steady, her fingers resting gently upon her chest. The wind sighed against the stained glass, but the light did not waver. The mist curled beyond the door, a pale, swirling sea, but within there was warmth, there was light, there was quiet strength. And then a voice rose, soft, clear, a faint, gentle song that seemed to drift like a quiet breeze. It was a child's voice, a small, trembling note that danced among the warm, golden light. Another voice joined, then another, until the air was filled with a soft, quiet hymn, a song of hope, a whisper of peace. The villagers stood together, their shadows mingling, their hands clasped, their voices a faint, gentle chorus that seemed to rise, to drift through the warm air, to brush against the cold mist beyond. In the heart of the church, the priest's voice rose, his words a quiet blessing. The healer's gaze softened, her lips moving in quiet prayer, her fingers brushing against the faint, delicate petals of a wildflower tucked within her shawl. And outside, beyond the warm golden glow, the mist swirled, pale and silent. But within, the light danced, the voices rose, and the village stood together, a quiet, gentle flame in a world of shadows. The village lay beneath the cold, grey sky. The mist twisted through the empty lanes, but from the church, a soft, golden light stretched out, a warm, quiet glow that whispered of hope, of peace, of faith. And within that glow, the villagers stood together, a fragile, gentle light in a world of shadows. Shadows. Chapter 14. A Fading Shadow. The village lay beneath a pale, soft mist, but the air felt different now, lighter, softer, touched with a faint whisper of warmth. Inside her small, cluttered cottage, the healer moved with slow, careful steps, her hands steady once more, her touch gentle and calm. She leaned over a narrow bed where a young boy lay, his cheeks no longer flushed with fever, his breath slow but steady. Her fingers brushed his forehead, cool and dry now, her touch light as a feather. His eyelids fluttered, a faint, sleepy smile brushing his lips. "Rest now, child," she whispered, her voice a soft, soothing murmur. "The fever is gone. You are safe." Beside the boy, his mother stood, her hands clasped against her chest, tears glistening in her eyes. She whispered a quiet prayer, her gaze never leaving the healer's calm, gentle hands. For days she had sat here, her heart heavy with fear, but now there was warmth, a quiet, trembling hope. The healer turned, her hands moving with quiet grace, mixing a fresh brew of herbs. The faint, sweet scent filled the room. Mint for calm, chamomile for sleep, a touch of thyme for strength. Her fingers were steady, her movements slow and careful, the herbs crushed beneath the weight of her palm, their scent rising in a faint, fragrant cloud. She moved from cottage to cottage, her shadow a quiet, gentle presence in the mist. Where her touch had once seemed helpless, now it was a soft promise. Fevered brows cooled beneath her gentle hands, trembling fingers found strength, and whispered prayers seemed to drift on a breeze of quiet peace. An old man, who had once shivered, beneath a thin blanket, now smiled weakly, his hand clasping hers with a faint, grateful grip. A young girl, her voice once weak and broken, now whispered a soft, quiet song, her small fingers playing with the wildflowers the healer had laid beside her bed. The mist curled around the village, pale and cool, but it no longer felt heavy. And beneath that soft silver shroud, the healer's touch moved like a quiet, gentle breeze, a whisper of life in a world that had almost forgotten how to breathe. The quiet streets stir beyond the healer's cottage. The village began to wake. The narrow lanes, once silent and empty, now stirred with quiet, careful steps. The mist still curled around the rooftops, clung to the bare trees, but within that pale, ghostly sea there was a new sound, a faint, soft laughter. Children peeked. From doorways, their small faces pale but bright, with wide, curious eyes. They whispered to one another, their voices soft, giggling beneath their breath as they watched the mist curl and twist around their feet. A small boy leaned from his window, his fingers tracing the cold, damp glass, his smile a faint, gentle curve. Mothers stepped from their cottages, their shawls wrapped close, their eyes cautious but calm. They whispered to one another, their voices a faint, murmuring hum that mingled with the rustle of the leaves. Some reached out, their fingers brushing against the damp air, feeling the cool mist melt against their skin. The wind stirred, a soft, cool breath that whispered through the narrow lanes. A small girl, her cheeks pale but her smile bright, stepped out with a faded ribbon in her hand. She tossed it into the air, watching as it twisted, danced, then floated gently to the ground. She laughed, a faint, clear sound that seemed to rise, to float above the mist. A boy kicked a small battered ball, its dull, scuffed surface rolling through the thin grass. Another child ran, his footsteps light, his laughter trailing behind him. It was not loud, not wild, a careful joy, a quiet, gentle whisper of life that stirred the silent village. The doors, which had stood shut and dark, now stood ajar, the pale light slipping through the cracks. Faces peered from behind curtains, cautious but curious, watching the mist with eyes that no longer seemed empty. And as the children's soft laughter brushed against the cold air, as the faint, gentle murmur of voices filled the lanes, the village seemed to breathe once more, a slow, quiet breath that whispered of life. The bells of hope from the old church tower, the bell rang out, a clear, soft chime that drifted through the mist, rising above the rooftops, brushing against the bare branches of the trees. But this time the bell did not toll in sorrow. Its voice was not heavy, not slow. It was a gentle, soothing whisper, a call that seemed to shimmer in the cool, silver air. The priest stood beneath the bell, his hands clasped, his face calm. His voice rose, a quiet, gentle prayer that drifted through the warm glow of the candles. His words were soft, simple, but they touched the quiet hearts of those who listened. Hope is a light. Even in the mist it shines, even in the shadows it whispers. The villagers, gathered within the warm glow of the church, lifted their eyes, their hands were clasped, their breaths slow, their hearts quiet but steady. Faces that had once been pale with fear now seemed touched with a faint, gentle light. The bell's voice danced through the village, a faint silver chime that seemed to weave between the cottages, to brush against the mist-shrouded paths, to reach even the quietest corners. In the lanes, children paused, their small faces lifted, their eyes wide. Mothers smiled faintly, their fingers brushing against their children's hair. Old men leaned against their doorways, their eyes closed, their breath a soft, steady sigh. The bell rang, its soft chime a gentle song that seemed to drift on the breeze. It was not loud, not fierce, but it was clear. A quiet, warm voice that whispered of something beyond the mist, something that lingered even in the shadows. Hope. A sky clearing. Slowly above the village, the pale grey sky began to shift. The thick, heavy clouds which had hung like a cold, endless blanket now stirred, their edges touched with a faint, soft light. The mist, which had curled through the lanes, clung to the rooftops, now seemed to lift, swirling gently, a pale silver sea that began to thin. A soft breeze whispered through the trees, brushing against the withered leaves, sending them fluttering like tiny, faded wings. The cold, damp air seemed to soften, a faint, warm breath that stirred the grass, that touched the pale green shoots, pushing through the dark soil. In the fields, where the earth had once been cracked and bare, there were faint touches of life. Small, green blades that swayed gently in the breeze, wildflowers that peeked from the damp earth, their pale petals touched with a soft, golden light. The villagers stepped from their cottages, their faces lifted, their eyes wide. They watched as the mist drifted away, as the clouds parted, a faint, pale sunlight spilling through, touching the cold earth with a gentle, warm glow. Children ran through the fields, their laughter a faint, soft chorus that danced on the breeze. Mothers knelt, their fingers brushing against the green shoots, their faces touched with quiet smiles. Old men leaned on their canes, their eyes bright, their breaths slow and calm. The healer stood at the edge of her cottage, her gaze lifted to the pale, soft sky. Her hands rested against her chest, her breath a faint, gentle sigh. Her shadow stretched behind her, thin and long, but there was warmth in her eyes, a quiet, gentle light. And as the sky cleared, as the pale sunlight washed over the village, as the mist melted into a soft silver whisper, the village seemed to breathe, a slow, calm breath that whispered of life, of hope, of days that stretched on, touched by light. The village stood beneath the pale, clear sky. The mist twisted, faint and silver, drifting through the fields. And within the quiet, gentle light, there was life. a soft, slow breath that whispered of hope, of a world that lived on even beneath the shadows. Chapter 15. Memories of Shadows. The village paths were quiet now, soft beneath the touch of morning light. The mist had thinned, a pale silver whisper that curled gently around the rooftops, drifting through the trees. But for the healer, each step along these winding lanes was a journey through memories. Her feet touched the damp earth, her shawl wrapped close around her thin shoulders, her silver hair swaying gently in the cool breeze. Each cottage she passed seemed to whisper a name, each shadowed doorway a silent story. Faces danced before her, faint, gentle ghosts that seemed to smile, to whisper, to watch her pass. She paused before the narrow cottage where a young mother had once sung to her child, her voice a soft, sweet lullaby that had drifted through the mist. Now the windows were open, fresh flowers blooming beneath the sill, but the mother's voice was gone. Only a quiet hum of the wind remained. A few steps farther, she saw the crooked door of the old man who had always shared a quiet smile, his hands weathered and strong. He would sit by his fire, a pipe in hand, his voice a soft, deep murmur of stories from a time long past. But now his chair stood empty, its seat touched by a faint layer of dust, the fire cold. The healer's gaze softened, her fingers brushing against the wooden gate of another cottage, a place where laughter had once echoed, where children's feet had pattered against the worn wooden floor. She could still see them. Bright eyes, tangled hair, tiny hands reaching for hers. But the windows were silent now, their light a pale, golden glow, their laughter a faint, distant memory. Her steps slowed, her breath a soft, steady sigh. She whispered their names, her voice a quiet, gentle murmur that drifted through the still air. She did not need to remember. They were already there, shadows dancing in the corners of her thoughts, faces that lingered like the mist. And as she walked, the wind stirred, a faint, cool touch that brushed against her cheek, that seemed to whisper back, a quiet, gentle promise that they were not truly gone. The graveyard's quiet. Bloom beyond the village, the graveyard stretched beneath the pale morning light. But it was no longer a place of shadows. The thick mist had lifted, leaving behind a soft, silver glow that danced across the grass, touching the stones with a warm, gentle light. Wildflowers grew among the graves, their colors bright and soft, pale yellows, delicate blues and warm, blushing pinks. Their petals swayed gently in the cool breeze, their sweet scent rising like a quiet song, a soft, fragrant whisper that drifted among the stones. The old wooden crosses, once leaning and grey, now stood among a sea of green and gold. Vines curled. Around the rough, weathered wood, tiny white blossoms peeking from beneath the leaves. The earth, which had once seemed so dark, was now touched with fresh green grass, a soft, living carpet that whispered beneath the healer's feet. She walked among the graves, her fingers brushing against the soft petals, her touch light, her gaze gentle. She paused before each name, her lips moving in a faint, silent whisper, a quiet prayer, a soft promise that they were remembered. A small bird fluttered among the branches above, its song a faint, cheerful note that seemed to rise and fall, a tiny voice that danced upon the breeze. And as it sang, another voice joined, then another. A quiet, gentle chorus that seemed to wrap around the graveyard like a warm, golden light. The healer knelt by a small, freshly bloomed patch of wildflowers, her fingers tracing the soft, cool leaves. Beneath her touch, a tiny bud unfurled, its pale pink petals opening to the light, its delicate fragrance a soft, sweet whisper. Here, where shadows had once lingered, where the earth had seemed cold and heavy, there was now life, a quiet, gentle bloom that whispered of peace, of memory, of a light that lingered even in the darkest places. Silent tears and gentle smiles. In the warm glow of the village square, the villagers gathered, their voices soft, their laughter a quiet, gentle sound. They stood in small circles, their faces touched by the pale sunlight, their eyes bright but calm. They spoke in low, steady voices, their words drifting on the cool breeze. "Do you remember old Tom?" a woman whispered, her smile touched with sadness. "He would always carve those little wooden birds, gave one to each of the children." A man nodded, his fingers tracing the edge of his worn hat. "And Anna? Her voice was like honey. She would sing by the well every morning. The whole village could hear her." A mother leaned down, her hands resting on her daughter's small shoulders. "And your friend Clara? She always braided flowers in your hair, remember?" The child smiled, her tiny fingers reaching up, as if she could still feel the soft, fragrant petals. The laughter was not loud, not bright. It was a soft, gentle sound, touched with a faint, quiet ache. Tears shimmered in their eyes, but they did not hide them. They whispered the names of those who were gone. They spoke of moments that danced like soft, fading shadows, but their words were not heavy. They were light, touched with warmth. Young man leaned against the low, moss-covered wall, his gaze distant, his voice a faint, calm murmur. "I still see them, you know. Sometimes, in the mist, their faces. I feel like they're watching us, smiling." And as the quiet murmur of voices filled the air, as the soft laughter drifted through the sunlight, there was a warmth that seemed to spread. A quiet, gentle light that touched the faces of those who remained. They did not forget, but they remembered with calm, with peace, with a quiet, gentle love. The healer's garden revived. At the edge of the village, the healer's cottage stood once more in the soft, golden light. But it was no longer a place of shadows. Beneath the eaves, fresh herbs hung, their leaves green and fragrant, their faint, sweet scent drifting through the cool morning air. Her garden, which had once withered beneath the grey, heavy mist, now bloomed with quiet, gentle life. Mint stretched in pale, soft waves, its leaves bright and cool. Lavender swayed in the breeze, its purple blossoms a soft, fragrant cloud. Tiny white chamomile flowers dotted the green, their sweet scent a soft, soothing whisper. The healer moved among them, her fingers brushing against the leaves, her touch light, her hands steady. She whispered to them, her voice a faint, calm murmur, her breath a soft, warm sigh. Her basket filled with fresh herbs, their cool leaves damp with morning dew. She carried them into her cottage, her steps slow but steady. Her shelves, once bare, were now lined with fresh bundles, their faint scents mingling in the warm air. The small table by the window held a bright, golden jar of wildflower honey, its surface touched with a soft light. A child knocked at her door, her small hand clasped, her smile bright but shy. "My mother," she says, "thank you for the tea you gave her. She feels better now." The healer smiled, her gaze soft, her fingers resting gently on the child's shoulder. "Tell your mother she is always welcome, my dear." And as the child ran back to the square, her laughter a faint, bright note that drifted on the breeze, the healer stood for a moment, her eyes soft, her heart calm. Her garden was green, Her hands were steady, her breath was slow and warm. She turned, her gaze lifting to the soft, pale sky, her heart a quiet, gentle whisper of peace. And as the sunlight touched the green leaves, as the herbs swayed in the breeze, the healer's garden bloomed, a soft, quiet promise of life, of memory, of a light that lingered even beyond the shadows. The village lay beneath the soft, golden sky. The mist drifted through the fields, pale and thin, a gentle whisper. But beneath that light there was life, a quiet, steady breath that whispered of memories, of laughter, of a world touched by sorrow, but held in gentle, lasting light. Chapter 16. A Village Reborn. Morning sunlight spilled gently over the village, a soft, golden light that washed across the rolling fields, touching the tall grasses and the wide, open sky. The mist, once heavy and pale, had melted into a faint, silver whisper that danced at the edge of the meadows, a quiet, distant memory. In the fields, the air was filled with warmth. The earth was soft and dark, freshly turned beneath the strong, steady hands of the farmers. Their laughter drifted on the breeze, a faint, cheerful hum that mingled with the rustling leaves and the quiet chirping of hidden birds. Old Thomas, his broad shoulders bent with age but his spirit bright, dug his spade into the rich soil, his weathered hands moving with the slow, steady rhythm of a life spent beneath the open sky. Beside him his son laughed, brushing the sweat from his brow, his voice a warm, cheerful note. "Look, father," the young man called, his gaze sweeping over the fresh rows of green shoots that stretched beneath the bright, open sky. "They've sprung up strong this year." The old man smiled, his eyes touched with quiet pride. "Aye, lad, the earth is kind, when we tend it with care." In another corner of the field, a young girl chased after a fluttering butterfly, her laughter, a soft, clear sound that seemed to rise like a sweet note upon the warm air. Her small fingers reached for the delicate wings, but the butterfly danced just out of reach, a bright, gentle spark that led her through the tall, swaying grass. Mothers knelt among the rows of green, their fingers brushing against the soft leaves, their faces touched with gentle smiles. They whispered to one another, their voices a quiet, cheerful murmur, their baskets filling with fresh herbs, green and fragrant. The fields were alive again, a soft green sea that swayed beneath the clear blue sky, its gentle waves touched with light. And the villagers moved among it, their laughter soft, their hearts light, their hands strong. The shadow had lifted, and the world breathed again. The market's murmur beyond the fields, the village square, hummed with quiet, cheerful life. Stalls lined the cobbled path, their colourful awnings swaying gently in the warm breeze. The air was sweet with the scent of fresh bread, the soft, buttery warmth drifting through the lanes, mingling with the faint, fragrant touch of wildflowers. Merchants called out, their voices warm and bright. "Fresh apples, sweet as honey," a woman sang, her basket overflowing with the bright red fruit, their skins touched with a soft, golden blush. "Warm pies, fresh from the oven," a man called, his stall a cosy, fragrant haven of golden crusts and sweet, spiced filling. Children raced through the square, their laughter a bright, clear song that danced upon the breeze. A small boy darted beneath a stall, his tiny hands clutching a bright blue ribbon while his sister chased him, her feet light, her smile wide. They weaved between the stalls, their laughter trailing behind them like a bright, cheerful ribbon. An old man played a soft tune on his fiddle, his fingers light upon the strings, his smile touched with quiet joy. his music rose, a gentle, dancing melody that seemed to twirl among the bright awnings, to brush against the warm sunlight, to swirl around the bustling square. A young mother leaned against the stall, her baby cradled in her arms, her smile warm as she listened to the soft, cheerful notes. A baker's son leaned from his stall, his flour-dusted hands waving to his friends, his voice a cheerful call that echoed beneath the wide, blue sky. The healer moved among them, her basket resting on her arm, its green herbs peeking over the edge, their fresh scent mingling with the sweet air. Her smile was calm, her steps light, her hands steady. She paused to share a quiet word with a mother, to offer a gentle touch to a child who smiled up at her, his cheeks bright and rosy. The market was alive, a soft, warm hum of life that drifted through the village, a quiet, cheerful song that whispered of peace, of light, of days touched with gentle joy. The church's warm glow at the heart of the village, the old church stood beneath the soft, clear sky, its warm golden light spilling through the open doors. Within, the candles burned brightly, their soft flames dancing in the gentle air, their warm light touching the rough, stone walls with a soft, golden glow. The priest stood before the altar, his face calm, his smile gentle. His voice rose, a quiet, soothing murmur that drifted through the warm air, a prayer that whispered of peace, of hope, of a light that lingered even in the shadows. "Blessed are those who remember, and blessed are those who heal," he whispered, his words a soft, gentle breeze that seemed to touch the hearts of those who listened. The villagers filled the pews, their faces touched with a quiet, gentle light. Some bowed their heads, their hands clasped in silent prayer. Others simply listened, their eyes calm, their hearts at peace. A soft, gentle hymn rose, the voices of the villagers a quiet, soothing chorus that drifted through the warm air. A song that seemed to rise like a gentle breeze, to touch the bright, stained glass windows, to dance among the soft, golden light. Children stood close to their mothers, their small hands clasped, their bright eyes wide, their voices a faint, sweet whisper among the soft, warm glow. An old woman closed her eyes, her lips moving in a quiet, trembling prayer, her face touched with a soft, gentle peace. The priest's voice rose once more, his words a soft, steady promise. "May this light guide you, may this peace hold you, and may this love forever touch your heart." And beneath that warm, golden glow, within the soft, calm light, the village seemed to breathe, a quiet, gentle breath that whispered of faith, of peace, of a light that never faded. The healer's peace. At the edge of the village, the healer stood in her garden, her hands strong, her touch gentle. Her herbs grew tall and green, their leaves bright beneath the warm sunlight, their soft, sweet scent drifting on the gentle breeze. Mint stretched in soft silver waves, its leaves cool and fresh beneath her touch. Lavender danced in the breeze, its purple blossoms a soft, fragrant cloud. Chamomile spread like a pale, golden carpet, its tiny flowers a soft, soothing whisper beneath the warm light. The healer's hands moved with quiet grace, her fingers light against the leaves, her touch a gentle whisper of care. Her gaze was calm, her smile soft, her breath slow and steady. A mother stepped through the gate, her young daughter skipping at her side. "Thank you for the tea," the mother whispered, her smile warm. "She sleeps so peacefully now." The healer smiled, her fingers brushing against the child's soft hair. "Peace is a gentle gift," she whispered, "one we share with love." and as they walked away, their laughter a soft, cheerful murmur, the healer turned, her gaze lifting to the soft, clear sky. Her heart was calm, her spirit steady. The shadows had passed, but the light remained. Her cottage was warm, the herbs hung in soft, fragrant bundles, their scent a sweet, soothing breath that drifted through the open window. Her shelves were lined with fresh jars, her table a quiet, gentle haven of green, fragrant life. And as she stood in her garden, her hands resting against the cool, green leaves, her breath a soft, gentle sigh, she smiled. Her garden bloomed, her hands were strong, her spirit was at peace. The village lay beneath the soft, golden sky. The fields stretched green and bright, the market hummed with gentle joy, and the church's warm glow spilled across the quiet square. And at the edge of the village the healer's garden bloomed, her hand steady, her heart calm. A village reborn. A quiet, gentle light that whispered of life, of peace, of a world touched by shadows but held in warmth. Warmth. Chapter 17. Echoes of Light. The village rested beneath a soft, pale sky, touched with the warm, gentle light of a fading afternoon. The mist that had once clung to the lanes was gone now, leaving the air clear, light, and sweet. But though the mist had lifted, its memory remained, a quiet, whispered echo that danced beneath the laughter, that lingered in the soft, warm smiles. In the square, the villagers gathered, not in sorrow, but in calm, gentle remembrance. They spoke in soft voices, their words drifting on the breeze, their laughter touched with a faint, quiet warmth. Mothers leaned close, their fingers brushing against the soft hair of their children, their voices low, their smiles bright, but calm. "Do you remember old Tom?" a man whispered, his voice a faint, warm murmur. Always sitting by the well, carving his wooden birds. Gave one to every child who asked. Beside him, a woman smiled, her gaze distant, her eyes touched, with a quiet, gentle light. And Clara, her voice was a song. Even the birds would hush just to hear her sing. A child leaned against his mother, his small fingers tracing the cool, rough stone of the fountain. Papa says they're stars now, watching us, smiling. An old man, his beard silver, but his eyes bright, leaned on his cane, his voice a soft, steady hum. They are not gone, not truly. Their stories live in our whispers. Their smiles dance in our laughter. The villagers shared their stories, quiet, gentle tales of those who had gone. They did not speak with tears, but with smiles, with soft, warm laughter, touched with a faint, sweet ache. Each name was a whisper, each memory a soft, golden light that seemed to linger, to dance upon the warm, gentle breeze. And as the sunlight stretched across the square, a soft, golden glow that touched the rooftops, the fields, the quiet lanes, the whispers of memory seemed to shimmer in the air. A soft, gentle light that whispered of love, of life, of those who were gone but never forgotten. The quiet, starry night, as the day drifted gently into twilight, the sky deepened, a soft, cool blue that stretched above the village, calm and endless. One by one the stars began to appear, faint silver sparks that shimmered in the quiet darkness, scattered across the sky like tiny, distant lanterns. The village lay quiet beneath their soft silver glow. The narrow lanes, the tall, swaying trees, the warm, cozy cottages, all were touched by the pale, gentle light of the stars. The breeze whispered through the leaves, a soft, cool breath that brushed against the rooftops, that stirred the long silken grass of the fields. Children leaned from their windows, their bright eyes wide, their small hands reaching toward the silver light, tracing the faint, twinkling shapes. A mother knelt beside her daughter, her voice a soft, gentle murmur. "There, see? That's the North Star. And there, the Great Bear." An old man stood in his doorway, his gaze lifted to the wide, starry sky, his breath a soft, slow sigh. His fingers brushed against the rough wooden frame, his heart touched with a quiet, gentle peace. By the well, 2 young boys lay upon the soft grass, their hands clasped behind their heads, their eyes fixed upon the silver sea above. "Do you think they watch us?" one whispered, his voice a faint, curious breath. "I think they do," the other replied, his voice calm, his smile soft. "I think they shine for us, to remind us we are never truly alone." The stars shimmered, their pale silver light a soft, gentle glow that wrapped the village in a warm, quiet peace. The wind whispered, a faint, soothing song that danced through the fields, that brushed against the quiet rooftops, that seemed to hum with a soft, gentle promise. And beneath that starry sky, the village rested, calm, quiet, its breath slow and steady, its heart touched with a light that whispered of peace, of memory, of a world held gently in the quiet arms of the night. A healer's gentle smile. At the edge of the village, the healer stood in her quiet garden, her hands resting. Against the cool, soft leaves of the mint, her gaze lifted to the wide, silver sky. The moon rose, a pale, gentle light that washed over the fields, touching the soft, green leaves with a faint, silver glow. Her breath was slow, calm, her smile soft. Her silver hair, touched by the moonlight, drifted gently in the cool breeze. Her hands, once trembling with fear, now rested strong and steady, her touch light, her heart warm. She watched the stars, her gaze calm, her heart touched with a quiet, gentle peace. Their soft, silver light shimmered, a faint, distant glow that seemed to whisper. A quiet, gentle song that drifted through the cool, still air. Her garden bloomed around her. Pale lavender swayed gently in the breeze, its soft, fragrant scent a sweet, calming whisper. The chamomile stretched in soft, golden waves, its tiny white blossoms swaying beneath the soft silver light. A small child peeked through the garden gate, her eyes wide, her cheeks bright. "Healer," she whispered, her voice a faint, curious note. "Do the stars watch over us?" The healer smiled, her gaze soft, her voice a warm, gentle murmur. "Yes, my child. They watch, they whisper. They guide us with their quiet light." The child's smile widened, her small fingers reaching for a soft, swaying sprig of lavender. "Then they must be very wise." The healer's laughter was soft, a faint, sweet note that drifted on the breeze. "Yes, perhaps they are." And, as the child ran back through the quiet lanes, her laughter a soft, cheerful song, the healer turned once more to the silver sky, her heart calm, her spirit a quiet, gentle whisper of peace. Life's gentle return, the village lay beneath the pale, silver sky, the stars a quiet, gentle light that danced above, but beneath that soft, silver glow, the village breathed a calm, steady breath that whispered of life, of warmth, of gentle, quiet joy. The fields stretched green and wide, their soft, swaying grasses touched with a pale, silver shimmer. The trees whispered in the breeze, their leaves a soft, rustling song. The narrow lanes, which had once stood empty and silent, now stirred with quiet, cheerful life. A young woman leaned against her cottage door, her hands resting on her rounded belly, her smile soft, her gaze lifted to the pale, starry sky. Her husband stood beside her, his arm wrapped gently around her shoulders, his breath a calm, steady sigh. Children whispered beneath the warm glow of their cottages, their soft voices a faint, cheerful hum. An old man leaned against the well, his voice a quiet, gentle song, his fingers plucking a soft, warm tune from his worn, wooden lute. The healer's garden bloomed in the moonlight, a soft, fragrant sea of silver and green. Her herbs swayed gently in the breeze, their sweet scent a quiet, soothing breath that drifted through the cool night air. The church stood warm and bright, its soft, golden light spilling through the windows, touching the square with a faint, gentle glow. Within, the candles danced, their warm light a quiet, steady promise. And the wind whispered, a soft, gentle song that danced among the trees, that drifted through the fields, that brushed against the quiet, sleeping cottages. It carried the faint, sweet scent of wildflowers, the soft, green breath of the fields, the quiet, warm glow of the village's quiet, gentle life. The village lay beneath the silver stars, calm, quiet, touched with a soft, gentle light. It had known sorrow, it had touched shadows, but it had found its light once more, a quiet, steady glow that whispered of peace, of memory, of a world where shadows danced but never stayed. A village reborn, touched by darkness, but held in gentle, lasting light.